7. Answerus Earth. After dinner, James was accompanied by Ralph and Rose to the Gryffindor common room. On the way, he told them about his conversation with Tabitha and her unsettling proclamation of Albus' potential, but neither of them seemed particularly impressed. "That's the way she always talks," Ralph said dismissively. "Even some of the Slytherins tend to view her as a bit of a drama queen." "You mean anyone other than you and Trenton?" James asked, arching an eyebrow. "They do seem to sincerely like Albus," Rose commented, stepping through the portrait. "Hole. Maybe it's all true. Maybe Albus is the boy of destiny. Apparently, that kind of thing runs in the family, just like dark hair and Quidditch skills." "It's not funny," James said, but he couldn't help smiling a little. "You should just come with me down to the Slytherin common room one of these nights," Ralph suggested. "See for yourself how Albus gets along with everybody. Honestly, he does seem to fit in pretty well. It'll put your mind at ease." The three made their way across the crowded common room, joining Noah, Damien, and Sabrina on a pair of couches in a dark corner. "We were just talking about you, James," Noah proclaimed, patting the couch cushion next to him. James flung himself onto the couch, happy to be among his friends. "We've got an idea," Sabrina said wisely, tapping the side of her nose. "Does it have anything to do with the Heracles window again?" Ralph asked, grinning. "That was a big hit, even with the Slytherins. Filch still hasn't gotten it entirely back to rights. Heracles' face keeps reverting to Malfoy's overnight." "It's all in the wrist," Damien said proudly, flexing his hand. "No, this is even better," Noah replied, leaning forward on the couch and lowering his voice. "It's this Debelos disaster that's got everybody in a lather. Seems that people don't so much mind a little physical training. I mean, the guy does have a point that battling the dark arts does sometimes require a little actual fighting. But this whole no-spells thing for the younger years is just over the top. And so it got us thinking. This has happened before," Sabrina said, smacking James on the shoulder. James glanced around at the gremlins. "I'm missing something," he admitted. "Back in your dad's day," Damien replied, rolling his eyes. "The reign of Umbridge the Terrible. Don't tell me we know more about your dad's school exploits than you do." "It wouldn't surprise me," James said, smiling crookedly. "It seems I haven't read any of the right books." Rose made an annoyed noise. "Umbridge was the DADA teacher," she explained. "She refused to teach them any usable defensive techniques because she was a ministry tool, back when the ministry was trying to squash any and all rumors about the return of he who must not be named. She pronounced the euphemism with obvious sarcasm." "I remember," James finally said, nodding. "But that's not what Debelos is about." Sabrina cut James off. "It amounts to the same thing. So your plan is to solve it the same way?" "Oh no," James said, shaking his head. "No way. I'm not starting up another Dumbledore's army. I just got done telling Cameron Creevey the other night that I'm not my father. I don't want people thinking I'm trying to relive all of his old adventures." "Not to fear," Noah said, throwing his arm around James' shoulders. "No one will be thinking that. For one thing, we can't use that name." "Agreed," Damien replied. "Too old school." "Maybe Merlin's army?" Sabrina shook her head. "Too copycat. How about just the real DAD8? "Too long and too commercial," Damien replied. "Look," no one interrupted, "the name doesn't matter. The point is, you lot need to know this stuff. If you don't get it until you're as bold and excellent as we are, it'll be too little, too late. You need to take matters into your own hands." "But I can't teach any of it," James exclaimed. "I barely know any of it myself." "Then I guess you need to find someone to teach it to you," Noah answered, shrugging. So why don't you three do it? James shot back. Can't happen, Damien said matter-of-factly. As great and inspiring as we may seem, we aren't teachers. You ever hear of muscle memory? It means that my hand knows how to cast an Expelliarmus spell, but my brain doesn't keep track of it anymore. It'd be like trying to explain how to walk. It's just second nature by now. No, you need a natural teacher, someone like your dad, back with the original Dumbledore's army. James turned to Ralph and Rose. Shouldn't you two be speaking up, telling me what a ridiculous and irresponsible idea this is? Actually, Rose said thoughtfully, I think it makes a good bit of sense. I mean, it's true that we really aren't learning anything useful in DeBello's class. Especially the girls. And honestly, Ralph added, I need all the help I can get with defensive magic. That's one area I've never really gotten a handle on. I'll say, James grudgingly agreed. But still, this could get us into a load of trouble. I don't see why, Rose reasoned. There are lots of extracurricular classes and clubs. It's not like in our parents' day when Umbridge forbade anyone from practicing defensive spells. It could be a completely sanctioned school club. All we'd have to do is get the headmaster's permission. You could ask, James. Merlin owes you one, after all. James glanced at Rose. She shrugged. This leaves just one problem, Ralph commented. Who will we get to teach? You'd need somebody with a good, basic grasp of the defensive arts, Sabrina said. Someone who's a natural leader and teacher, with some experience in actual battle. An idea occurred to James. His eyes widened, and then he slumped slowly in his seat. What? Rose asked, frowning. I think I just thought of the perfect teacher, James replied dolefully. Ralph said, so why is that a problem? Because, James grinned crookedly, I don't think he'll ever agree to do it. Rose narrowed her eyes. After a moment, she smiled knowingly. Who? Noah asked. Can't tell, James answered. But if we can talk him into it, I'll let you know. The Gremlins seemed a bit annoyed at James' secrecy, but were generally content that their idea had been adopted. After a while, the group broke up, leaving only James, Ralph, and Rose in the dark corner. Do you think Cedric would ever do it? Rose asked earnestly, keeping her voice low. No. Ralph exclaimed, smacking his forehead. I knew I should have known who you two were talking about. All we can do is ask him, James answered. People say he had natural leadership skills. He was good enough to get into the Triwizard tournament, and he made it through all the challenges, so he has plenty of experience. And from his perspective, it's all still fresh, Rose agreed. Ralph asked, but where can we find him? Last year, he just seemed to show up when he wanted to. We still don't really know where he hangs out. James looked hard at Ralph, thinking. Actually, I might have an idea about that. We should ask the headmaster first, Rose said. That way, we don't bother Cedric with it unless it's for sure. Let's all go together, tomorrow, after lunch. That'll give us a chance to figure out the best way to present the idea. James nodded. Sounds all right, I suppose. You don't think it's a good idea? Rose asked, putting her head on one side. No, I guess it's a good idea, James admitted. I just hate the idea of looking like I'm trying too hard. You know, doing everything like my dad did. Like I told Cameron, I'm not the one with the lightning bolt scar on my forehead. Rose studied James. Then, why do you keep rubbing it? James dropped his hand, suddenly realizing that he was indeed touching his forehead. What do you mean? You've been rubbing at your forehead for the last few days, Rose replied. You look like an advertisement for Haberdasher's anti-headache headwear. It's true, Ralph added, nodding. Maybe you should wear your glasses more if not wearing them is making your head hurt. James was somewhat annoyed. It's not my bloody glasses. I don't know what it is. I've just got an itch, that's all. You've got a constant itch on your forehead? Ralph blinked. It's not constant, James said. He glanced at Ralph and Rose. Is it? Rose looked a bit concerned. Maybe you should go see Madame Curio down in the hospital wing, James. That's the last thing I need, James said, chuckling. It's nothing, really. I barely even noticed it. It does seem a little weird though. You've just been thinking about it all too much, Rose said reasonably. No one is expecting you to be your father. Don't obsess over it. James agreed, and he hoped Rose was right. As he said goodnight and climbed the stairs, he wondered about the phantom itch on his forehead. He really hadn't given it any thought until now, but it was just a little bit strange, wasn't it, having a persistent itch in the place of his father's famous scar. No way would he be asking Madame Curio about it. It was bad enough, what with Cameron Creevey expecting him to shoot fireworks out of his bum on one hand, and Scorpius Malfoy accusing him of delusions of grandeur on the other. The last thing he needed was for a rumor to get started that James Potter was scratching at a phantom lightning bolt scar. Especially on top of the fact that he very well might be starting a club reminiscent of his dad's Dumbledore's army. As James was getting ready for bed, it occurred to him that, had he not had the conversation with Tabitha Corsica and gone away feeling worried and peeved, he might not have agreed so easily to the creation of the new DADA club after all. Her words had left him feeling small and ridiculous, but the idea of starting a new defense club gave him a feeling of importance again. Was that reason enough to go through with it? He hoped it was a good idea, but really, he wasn't overly concerned about it. There were still 2 hurdles that needed to be overcome for the club to happen. The first was to get Merlin's approval, the second was to find Cedric and ask him to teach it. If either refused, then the club would never be. That seemed like good enough odds to James. Thinking that, he closed his eyes and drifted to sleep. A gray, humid afternoon greeted James, Rose, and Ralph as they finished their Saturday lunch and headed out to wander the school grounds. It was one of those strange days at the beginning of autumn when it is too muggy to wear a jacket but too wet and breezy to go without. Rose huddled in a heavy jumper as James and Ralph threw rocks into the lake, admiring the splashes. I think we should just ask him straight up, Ralph said, heaving a stone sidearm. Like you said last night, Rose, there's no reason for him to say no. That's what I thought then, Rose replied. But that was last night. James glanced back at her. A lot's changed since then, has it? I stayed up late last night, reading, Rose said. I wanted to get a head start on some of the books our Wesley textbook suggested, like I told you in the library. You sure don't waste time, Ralph commented. I happen to like reading. Besides, not surprisingly, our headmaster shows up occasionally in some of those books, and I thought it'd be worth checking into his history a bit more before we talked to him. Ralph lowered his throwing arm and looked up at the sky, squinting. It's so weird. I was there when it happened, but I keep forgetting our headmaster is the famous Merlin from all the old legends and myths. It's a little hard to wrap your mind around, isn't it? I told you a lot of people find it a bit unsettling that Mayor Linus Ambrosius is headmaster of Hogwarts, Rose said meaningfully. And I found out why, a little bit. There's loads of stories about him in the old books of the kings. It's almost impossible to figure out what's made up and what might be real, but even if only a tiny bit of it is true, it's pretty worrying. Like what? James asked, prying a large rock out of the bank of the lake. Like kings used to hire him to curse armies. Not bad armies, necessarily, just any army that any king with enough treasure happened to dislike. More than once, when Merlin got to the army he was paid to curse, they would send out people to pay him more to go back and curse the king that had originally hired him. And he did. Sounds pretty practical, if you ask me, Ralph said, heaving a stone with both hands. It splashed nearby, wetting both James and Ralph's shoes. This isn't funny, Ralph, Rose admonished. He was a magical mercenary. A man like that wouldn't have any loyalty at all. Some of those armies, he cursed. They got completely slaughtered, sometimes even before they got to the battle. There'd be floods, cyclones, even earthquakes, where the ground would open up right beneath the army camp, swallowing them all whole. That can't be true, James commented. I mean, Merlin's powerful, but nobody can do that. You're forgetting where Merlin gets his magic from, Rose replied as if she'd been prepared for such an argument. According to the legends, Merlin can tap into the power of nature. We saw him doing that the night he took us to get his stuff. Nature is huge, and it was even huger back then, with less civilization. Who knows what a wizard like that would be able to do? Ralph brushed his hands off on his jeans. I don't think huger is a word. Don't you start correcting me, Rose said, looking back and forth between James and Ralph. Why are neither of you taking this seriously? Because like I said, we were there, Rose, Ralph replied. We saw the man reapparate from the Dark Ages. We worked with him in the days after. He helped us get rid of that Muggle reporter, who was going to blow the lid off the whole magical world. He was completely brilliant about it. He may have been a loose cannon in the past, but he's different now, isn't he? He's trying to be good, and he seems to be doing pretty well with it. Well, Rose said, it isn't just that he was a loose cannon. James plopped down on the grass next to her. What? Did he put ketchup on his eggs? Did he draw mustaches on portraits? Rose looked at him, and then looked away. According to some of the legends, he was supposed to be the bearer of an awful curse. His returning was to be an omen of the end of the world. James felt a twinge of worry at that, but kept his voice even. This is the part where it's hard to separate the fact from the loony, made-up stuff, right? Laugh if you want, Rose said, but the prophecy shows up in a lot of places. Some call him the harbinger of doom. Other places just call him the ambassador of what? It never says. It gets pretty creepy, she admitted, shuddering. Especially when you are reading it in the middle of the night. So far, he's just been the ambassador of an extra 10 points for Gryffindor and Slytherin because we helped him go get some magic box, Ralph said, shrugging. Come on, it's almost 2. He'll be expecting us. You coming, James? Rose asked, climbing to her feet. James glanced up. What? No. Yeah, sure. The three plodded through the foggy afternoon, heading for the courtyard. In the distance, thunder rumbled like a veiled threat and the wind began to switch. James was thinking rather nervously of the skeleton in the cave, Farragon, the long-lost associate of Merlin, and of Cousin Lucy's letter about the Gatekeeper. In the light of those things, Rose's tale of the legendary curse of Merlin sounded uncomfortably familiar. James couldn't remember it exactly, but the skeleton had said something about a gate, and about things coming through, all because of Merlin's return. The Borleys had come through, at the very least. Merlin acknowledged that. But he claimed to have captured all of them except for the last one, the one that had followed James from that night at the Grotto Keep. Merlin said he'd trapped them all in his mysterious dark bag. But the skeleton had warned of something else, something worse. Like the legends, it had also called Merlin the ambassador, but Farragon had identified the thing Merlin was supposedly representing, the guardian, the sentinel of worlds, the gatekeeper. Lucy's letter had corroborated those legends, and now Rose's studies were confirming them as well. James shuddered as he followed Rose and Ralph into the castle. They threaded their way through the weekend-empty corridors, passing darkened classrooms and halls. Finally, They reached the gargoyle, which guarded the entrance to the spiral steps. "You remember the password, Rose?" Ralph asked. "I couldn't even pronounce it, and you know how they are about writing things like that down." Rose screwed up her face, thinking. Finally, she carefully pronounced, "Inoisu." The gargoyle moved with the sound of millstones grinding. It stepped aside, revealing the doorway. "What's it mean?" James asked as he hopped onto the rising staircase. Rose shook her head. "It's more of that ancient Welsh, I'd guess." "Who knows what it means?" They arrived in the hall outside the headmaster's office, and James reached to bang the door knocker. "Wait," Rose said, grabbing James' arm. "Remember this morning? He told us to wait outside. He said he had another appointment before us." James remembered. He carefully lowered the knocker, and the three settled onto a long bench situated across from the headmaster's door. On the wall next to the door, amongst an arrangement of old paintings and portraits, was a face James recognized. "Look," James nudged Ralph, pointing. "I remember him. Old Stonewall used him in technomancy last year to teach us about magical portraits." The portrait of Cornelius Yarrow, former Hogwarts bursar, peered at James over his spectacles. "I remember you too, young man. You had a rather unseemly number of questions regarding the subject. I hope you were satisfied." "I was," James answered. "I especially liked the part about how only the original artist can destroy a magical portrait. It was really wicked when Stonewall melted his painting of that horrid clown." "Your Professor Jackson did leave out one small detail," Yarrow sniffed, chafing at the memory. "There is one other person who can destroy a portrait, although it has never been known to happen." "Seems like a pretty important detail to leave out," James frowned doubtfully. "Frankly, with all due respect, I'd trust him rather more on the subject than." Two things happened simultaneously, interrupting James. The door to the headmaster's office unlatched and swung open, and a stab of pain shot through James' forehead. He clapped a hand to his head and squeezed his eyes shut, hissing in surprise. "James?" Rose asked, concerned. Almost as quickly as it had come, the pain vanished. James kept his hand to his forehead but risked opening his eyes. The first thing he saw was the view through the headmaster's open doorway. Merlin was standing behind his desk, his face grave and his eyes piercing. He was staring very hard at James through the doorway, but the look on his face did not seem worried or alarmed. If anything, he looked intently watchful, perhaps even wary. "Are you all right, James?" another voice asked. James lowered his hand and looked around. Petra Morgenstern was standing in the hall, having just exited the headmaster's office. She looked flushed, and her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying. "I'm fine," James answered. "I should be wearing my glasses." He glanced at Rose and Ralph, warning them not to say anything. "So," Petra said, looking away. "Well, I'll see you later. I've got things to do." James watched her walk away, wondering once again why Petra seemed so melancholy all of a sudden. And what in the world had Merlin said to her to upset her even more? James stood, looking back into the headmaster's office again. Merlin was no longer staring at him with that hard, watchful look. He was turned to the side, studying a complicated brass device in his hands. "Come in, my friends," Merlin called without looking. As the three students entered the office, James couldn't help looking around in awe. Save for the old headmaster's portraits and the desk, the room was virtually unrecognizable as the same space McGonagall had occupied last term. A massive stuffed crocodile hung from the ceiling, looking like an exhibit in a museum. Bookshelves crowded the floor, crammed with enormous volumes in thick, leather covers. Alongside these were arcane tools and fixtures, none smaller than a cabinet, and all mind-bogglingly complex. Attached to the wall behind Merlin's desk was a glass case housing a thick black sack, hung on silver hooks. James recognized it as the mysterious dark bag. The centerpiece of the room, however, was a very large, long mirror with a rectangular golden frame. The silvered glass of the mirror only half reflected the room. Beyond the reflection, a swirling, leaden mist rolled and shifted. It was both beautiful and vaguely sickening. The mirror rested on a long brass easel in the center of the room, facing the headmaster's desk. As promised, the headmaster said, "The contents of my cache. Not all of it, of course, but enough to make my job rather easier." There was only one chair facing the headmaster's desk. James, Ralph, and Rose gathered around it, though none chose to sit on it. They continued to look around the room in awe. "You've noticed my mirror, Mr. Potter," Merlin said conversationally, still not looking up from the strange device he was holding. "Very curious, yes? I see that you wish to ask me about it. Please feel free." "What does it do?" James replied bluntly. "The real question, Mr. Potter, is what doesn't it do?" Merlin said, finally setting the strange brass device on his desk and looking up. "It is the legendary Answerous Earth, the quintessential magic mirror of time immemorial. With the help of its focusing book, it can show you the past and the future. It can show you places you have been and replay ancient memories. It can even tell you, if you so wish, who is the fairest in the land. I fail to see the practical purpose of such information, but the mirror's designer was a bit of an eccentric." Merlin stood and moved slowly around his desk, approaching the mirror. Only 2 such mirrors were ever made. The sister of this one belonged to an associate of mine who, like all of my associates, is long since dead. That mirror, alas, is also lost to the mists of time. Rose stared at the swirling, silvery mist in the mirror. Why were there only 2 ever made? Merlin reached the mirror and pulled a braided cord. A thick black curtain dropped over the face of the mirror. "Such pieces are very difficult to create, Miss Weasley. More importantly, the world can only contain so many very powerful magical devices. They weigh heavily on the balance of the cosmos. Too many at any given time can cause wrinkles. Before my return, I lived at the tail of a much darker time when such wrinkles were commonplace. Fortunately, the age we now occupy is much better adjusted. Still, a few relics of the age of extraordinary magical devices remain." Merlin looked about with some pride. "Most of them are here in this very room." Ralph swallowed and said, "Is it all, safe?" "Of course not, Mr. Deedle," Merlin replied easily, returning to his desk. "Any more than a wand is safe. But it is contained, and that is the important thing." "Did you show Petra something in that mirror?" James asked suddenly, looking at the headmaster's face. Merlin didn't flinch. "I would say that is none of your concern, Mr. Potter, but I have lived in this age long enough to know that would only heighten your curiosity." "Yes, I did." "Is that why she was so upset when she left?" "What did you show her?" "I showed her what she came asking to see," Merlin replied evenly, seating himself. "Nothing more and nothing less. If you wish to know further, you may consult Miss Morgenstern directly, although she might find such an interrogation less than welcome. Now, what can I do for the 3 of you?" As he spoke, he reached across his desk and carefully closed a large book near the edge, the mirror's focusing book, James assumed. Rose maneuvered herself slightly in front of James. "We, just came to ask about starting a club, headmaster." "What manner of club?" Merlin asked briskly. "Well, practice club," Rose stammered. "I mean, a club for practicing spells, defensive techniques, and things like that." Ralph interrupted. "It's not that we don't like Professor DeBellows or anything, either. He's really great. We just want to practice. I understand that the good professor doesn't prefer to be called a professor, Merlin said, allowing a tiny smile. That's true, Ralph agreed, his face reddening. Kendrick, then. What sort of spells do you intend to practice? And who do you expect to be involved? Anyone who wants to be involved, James answered. And we'll just be practicing basic defensive techniques. Stuff we learned in our classes last year. We'll only be practicing on dummies and targets, never each other. Any teachers who want to supervise can come, of course. Although I expect that it'd be a little boring. James stopped, feeling that last bit might have been too much. He was counting on the fact that no teacher would wish to volunteer for any extra time in class just to watch a bunch of students fling Expelliarmus spells at wooden dummies, but Merlin was quick enough to see through such a ruse. Knowing him, he might just assign a rotation of teacher chaperones, and DeBellows would probably be first on the list. Merlin opened his mouth to respond when, suddenly, the brass device on his desk shifted. Everyone in the room looked down at it. It was something like a hollow globe made of interconnected brass hoops, marking the globe's latitudes and longitudes. Inside, a complicated network of gears and ratchets operated a silver pointer. The pointer had begun to spin, making the globe roll slightly on the desk. After a moment, the pointer ceased spinning, ratcheted upwards a few notches, and went silent. Merlin stared at it. What is? Ralph began, but Merlin interrupted him. You may proceed with your club, my young friends. Please send me a notification of when and where you plan to meet as well as a list of students who choose to be involved. After all, what kind of headmaster would I be if I didn't keep abreast of such things? Merlin had produced an official parchment with the Hogwarts crest emblazoned on the top. He scribbled a few notes on it and signed his name at the bottom with a flourish. This should suffice in terms of official sanction. I wish you the best of success. Ralph glanced at James, wide-eyed and smiling in relief. But Headmaster, Rose began. If you will excuse me, Merlin said, rising, it happens that I have some unexpected business to attend to. I'd hate to detain you, as I expect that you have preparations to make. Please do see yourselves to the staircase, and close the door on your way out, thank you. Thank you, sir, Ralph said, herding James and Rose toward the door. You won't regret it. Ralph. Rose hissed. The three nearly stumbled over each other as they crowded through the doorway. You won't regret it. Rose whispered at Ralph, rounding on him in the hallway. What kind of thing is that to say? You want him to be suspicious? Ralph grimaced. I was nervous. So sue me. Come on, let's just get out of here before he changes his mind. James was just pulling the door shut when he stopped suddenly, his eyes going wide. The permission parchment, he exclaimed, looking from Ralph to Rose. Did either of you kick it up? I didn't get it, Ralph said. I thought Rose got it. She was closest. You shoved us out of there before I could get to it, you giant prat. I'll get it, James said, turning back. The door hadn't yet latched shut. He pushed it slightly open, peering in. Headmaster, he called. We forgot the parchment you signed for us. Can I just? James frowned and pushed the door further open. The headmaster's desk was vacant. The room appeared to be completely empty and was almost unnaturally still. Perhaps Merlin had gone somewhere by flow network. The brass device on his desk must have been an alarm or a reminder, telling him of a meeting he had to rush off to. James walked across the office and grabbed the parchment from the headmaster's desk. As he turned back toward the door, a strange feeling came over him. With a sudden chill, he remembered the dart of pain that had shot through his forehead when he'd been waiting in the hall, right before he'd seen Merlin staring at him through the door. His heart quickening, James looked around and saw why the office seemed so unnaturally still. Across the rear wall of the office, from floor to ceiling, were the dozens of portraits of the former headmasters. Among them, of course, were the portraits of Severus Snape and Albus Dumbledore, although as usual, Dumbledore's portrait was empty. Every portrait was perfectly still and silent. Ralph and Rose had edged into the room, following James. Rose was staring at the portraits, her eyes wide and nervous. "Now that's just eerie," she said in a low voice. "This is the only place on earth where a wall full of unmoving paintings is a bad omen," Ralph said. "But I am in total agreement with you, Rose. What's going on here? Where's Merlin?" James crossed the room and stood in front of the portrait of Severus Snape. He had spoken to this portrait several times last term, and had been insulted by it on more than one occasion. Gingerly, he reached out and touched the portrait's face. He could feel the texture of the dried paint, feel the stroke that formed the man's hook nose. The face didn't so much as blink. Rose gasped. "Look," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James turned. The black curtain had once again been lifted from the answerous earth, but the surface of the magic mirror no longer showed merely swirling, leaden smoke. It showed a scene. The view was hazy and murky, as if seen through a very dirty, very imperfect window. James and Ralph joined Rose by the mirror and peered past their reflections, trying to make sense of the cloudy scene. The view looked through a stand of gnarled trees into a thick forest. It was very foggy, and the trees were dense enough to block most of the stormy daylight. There was a small clearing beyond the nearer trees, and in the center of the clearing was a sort of monument, caked with moss and vines. It was tall, thin, and leaning. As the scene moved in and out of murkiness, James could see that the monument was a statue of a man. The stone figure was rather handsome, dressed in a very old-fashioned suit. On the base of the statue were lines of engraving, but James couldn't make them out. Rose suddenly covered her mouth, stifling a gasp. "I know what that place is," she whispered. But why would the mirror be showing this? James had a terrible feeling he also knew the place. He'd heard about it but never seen it. Very few people ever had. On the base of the statue, just below the unreadable words, 3 large letters were engraved, TMR. TMR, Ralph said wonderingly, then gasped. Tom Marvolo Riddle. Is it really Voldemort's grave? Who'd bury a monster like him? Nobody knows, Rose said quickly, still studying the ghostly scene. There was an anonymous donation for the burial costs and the monument, specifying that he was to be buried as Tom Riddle and not Voldemort. No wizarding cemeteries would accept the remains, though. They finally buried him in a secret location in an unplottable forest. Hardly anyone even knows where it is. In the mirror, a figure moved. The 3 students gasped in unison. The figure hadn't walked into the scene, nor had it appeared. It was as if it had been there all along, but no one had noticed it. Only when it moved slightly was its presence made known. It wore a long, black, hooded robe which obscured its face, but there was something very unsettling about the fabric of the robe. It looked more like a robe-shaped hole in space, filled with swirling, churning dark smoke. The ragged bottom of the robe did not quite reach ground, and yet no feet came out of it. James shuddered at the sight of the awful figure, thinking of the tabloid clipping Lucy had sent him. It had referred to the creature of smoke and ash. Could this be that entity? Could this be the gatekeeper? The figure raised an arm, revealing one thin, white hand. The hand seemed to beckon. A moment later, the statue of the youthful Voldemort shuddered. The proud expression went out of its face and the arms dangled like a puppet with its strings cut. And then, distantly, a voice spoke. It came out of the mirror, very faintly, barely heard over the sound of the wind and the creaking trees. Are you he whose echo has called to me? The voice of the hooded entity asked. He whose motives, more than anyone else's in this sphere, once aligned with mine. Reveal yourself. The statue spoke, and its voice was very high and misty, nearly lost. I am Tom Marvolo Riddle, also known as Lord Voldemort, dead of this world these many years, reclaimed to dust, passed on to the realm of torment. And yet, the robed entity said, your imprint is strong enough to draw me. Your mortal remains are of no use to me, therefore, it must be your intention to tell me who bested you, that I may seek him for my purposes. He who bested me is no friend to you, the statue stated blandly, its voice nearly lost in the rising wind of that far-off place. He was a boy then, but even then, he was stronger than could be deceived by your kind. He shall not assist you. But there are others. The vision in the glass was growing fainter. James reached out to touch the mirror, to lean on it, but Rose stopped him. Even now, they await you, the dead voice of Tom Riddle said. It is as you say, I am merely an echo, a memory, a fading ripple of a life gone. But they can bring you to another. One in whose heart beats my own essence. They are prepared for you. They await you here, this very night. At that, another figure pushed through the branches, moving out of the shadows of the trees. James couldn't make out the figure's face, but he could tell it was a man. Like the first figure, he was dressed in a hooded robe, but because of the man's position, James could see his face. He was pale and wary, but his eyes were resolute. The trees had begun to pitch and groan as the wind increased. The sounds of the place began to drown out the distant voices. James could barely make out the words of the pale man. We are prepared for you, O Master of the Void, he said, holding out his hand. We have been awaiting you, as has been the whole world. Your time is near. Suddenly, a third figure moved out of the woods, opposite the pale man. This figure was also dressed in black but was taller than the pale man. He didn't clamber out of the woods, as had the pale man, but moved with a sort of malevolent grace, stepping out into the clearing to face the shrouded form of the gatekeeper. James was dismayed. Something about the proud, effortless gait of the taller figure made him think of Merlin. The pale man did not seem surprised to see the third figure, although his wariness increased. He smiled thinly. The tall man and the gatekeeper exchanged words, but a crack of thunder drowned them out. The wind grew to a steady howl, bearing the promise of a storm. Fat drops of rain began to fall, and the image started to blur. Suddenly, the pale man glanced around and then pointed, up and out, and James gasped. He'd pointed directly at James, as if seeing him through the mirror glass. The man's pale face stared right into his eyes. The taller man turned as well, but if it was Merlin, James couldn't tell because of the shadow of his hood. Worst of all, the face of the statue had also turned. The stone representation of Tom Marvolo Riddle looked out of the mirror at James, grinning an empty, carved grin, showing all its teeth. James stumbled backwards, away from the mirror, and bumped into the desk. He barely heard Ralph and Rose calling him, grabbing him, trying to pull him toward the door. Come on. Rose called frantically. We have to get out of here. They saw us. And it looks like they're coming. They are coming. James' eyes widened. Suddenly, he turned, looking down at the desk behind him. The focusing book was open. There was only one notation on the page, written in Merlin's own hand, grave of the sought host. Without thinking, James used both hands to slam the book shut. Instantly, thunder boomed right outside the office window. Lightning flickered and a gust of cold wind roared into the room, lifting the curtains. Potter, a voice rang out stridently. James spun on his heels. The portraits were all alive again. Most of them were looking around and blinking. Parchments swirled into the air as wind shifted wildly through the room, whickering through the curtains. The portrait of Snape glared at James, its eyes wide and very black. "What do you think you're doing? This is old magic. Magic like you have never imagined. You must leave this place. Now. Quickly." Ralph grabbed James and pulled, dragging him toward the door, which swung wide open of its own accord. "Come on," Rose called, running through the doorway and looking back. The door began to close again, cutting her off. James lunged, following Ralph. Snape's face was tense, dreadful, as James ran past, slipping through the doorway a moment before the heavy door slammed shut with a reverberating crash. James and Ralph barreled into Rose, and all three collapsed onto the bench in the hall, hearts pounding and breathless. As one, they scrambled back up and ran toward the spiral staircase, clambered down to the corridor below. They kept running until they reached a wide balcony where they finally pounded to a clumsy halt, breathing hard and staring wild-eyed at each other. "I hope," Ralph wheezed, bending over with his hands on his knees, "that one of us at least remembered the parchment this time." After a night of squalls and thunderstorms, Sunday morning dawned like a blooming flower, kindling rose-colored sparkles in the drenched grass and trees. After breakfast, James, Ralph, and Rose picked their way across the wet lawns to Hagrid's hut, where they banged on the door. When the half-giant didn't answer, the three students followed the stone path around to the back. There, they found Hagrid and his bull-mastiff, Trife, moving about in the curling vines and broad leaves of the pumpkin patch. Hagrid was humming cheerfully, wet up to his knees as he rolled and weeded his pumpkins. "Good mornin', ya lot. Fancy seein' the three of ye out and about this early on a weekend." "Good morning, Hagrid," Rose said, sweeping beads of water off the top of one of the huge pumpkins. Satisfied it was mostly dried, she sat on it. "We came out to talk to you about something." "Blimey," Hagrid replied, "with ya here, young Rose, it really is just like old times. Come now, let's go on inside. I was just tellin' Trife here that we ought to brew a mornin' tea, I was. We can talk all we want by the stove." They made their way inside, and Hagrid hung an enormous copper teapot on a hook over the fire. James, Rose, and Ralph clambered onto the oversized chairs around the table. "Hagrid," Ralph began, glancing at Rose, "we saw something when we were up in the headmaster's office yesterday. Rose thinks maybe we should tell someone about it because it could mean trouble." James kicked the table leg idly and glared out the window. "Not everybody agrees with Rose, mind you." "How can you say what we saw wasn't cause for alarm, James?" Rose demanded. "Even Ralph agrees that." "I'm not saying that it isn't cause for alarm," James interrupted, glaring back at Rose. "I just don't think it means the headmaster is in on it like you keep wanting to believe." "I don't want to believe it, but there's such a thing as evidence. There's seeing a man in the mirror who looks and moves suspiciously like the headmaster. You said so yourself. And he was consorting with known enemies and outright scary people. And at least one of them I don't think was even human. Not to mention the statue of you-know-who." "Whoa, now, wait just a minute, ye three," Hagrid said, scowling and settling himself into his old easy chair. "I don't know what ye saw, but let's not be dragging that old beastie out in the open. Yeah, just tell me what happened, why don't ye?" Rose began to explain what had happened the day before, beginning with their interview with the headmaster. As the story progressed, James and Ralph joined in, adding their own insights and corrections, so that by the time they were explaining how the portraits came back to life and the painting of Snape warned them to flee, all three of them were talking at once. Finally, they finished the account and fell silent, turning to view Hagrid's response. The half-giant sat in his huge old chair by the fire, a distant, tense look on his face. He was looking in the direction of the three students but not directly at any of them. James had been confident that Hagrid would simply dismiss the tale as wild exaggeration. He'd tell them that what they'd seen in the mirror had just been small-time shenanigans, engaged by men who refused to accept the fact that they'd long since lost the war. James knew from his father that, while Hagrid may not always love the leaders of Hogwarts, he was loyal to the core. He'd defend Merlin, and assure them that there was absolutely nothing to worry about. That was partly why James had suggested they come out to the hunt to talk to the big man. Now, as Hagrid sat in silence with that strange, tense look on his face, James wondered if it had been such a good idea after all. Suddenly, the teapot began to shriek, causing everyone in the room to jump. Hagrid shook himself, and then reached to pull it from the hook. He carried it to the table and clanked it onto a trivet. "Yar," James said, prodding. "What do you think, Hagrid?" Hagrid glanced at him, wiping his hands on a huge towel. "Well, it's a bit difficult, innit? Who's to say? Could have been anything, I suppose. The headmaster, he's got some terrible powerful devices and all. Old Professor Snape's portrait was pro-LLY right telling you to stay well away. But Rose is saying she thinks it was Merlin that showed up by Voldemort's grave," James clarified, gesturing at his cousin. "Tell her she's daft if she thinks that. I mean, he's the headmaster, Hagrid." China clattered as Hagrid gathered saucers and cups, returning to the table with his arms full. "Right, yeah, James. He is the headmaster, and all I can say's if he did show up in that mirror, talking to whoever it was ye saw, then he must've had plenty good reason to. But it couldn't have been him," James insisted, looking to Ralph for support. "I mean, the thing in the swirling robe was obviously 10 kinds of evil, and that bloke that showed up first had to have been an old Death Eater. I mean, it was Voldemort's ruddy gravesite." "I'd appreciate it if you didn't say that name at my table, James," Hagrid said gently, setting a cup and saucer in front of him. His hands trembled slightly. "I know the battle's long over, but old habits die hard, yeah, understand." Rose stirred in her seat. "Hagrid, do you think it could have been Merlin we saw?" Hagrid poured steaming water into the cups before he answered. Finally, he settled himself onto one of the chairs, producing a strained creak. He looked hard at Rose, and then stirred his tea with surprising delicacy. "They say that the headmaster's the good man with a garden," Hagrid said, as if changing the subject. "I don't do a whole lot of reading myself, of course, but everyone knows that Merlin the Great was a keen one for nature and plants and such. I've been hearing stories about how he spoke to the birds in the trees since I was a wee lad. So when he came on as headmaster early this summer, I thought I'd go up and make my acquaintance. I invited him to come down to the hunt so I could show him my own little garden. Next day, sure enough, he takes me up on the offer. He traipses all over the garden, not saying the slightest thing. He just walks up and down, in and out, tapping that big staff o' his on my pumpkins and squashes and cabbages. Finally, he looks up, out toward the forest. I looks too, 'cause there's something rising up out of the trees." Hagrid still had the teaspoon in his huge hand. Gently, he set it next to his saucer. He looked at James, Ralph, and Rose one by one. It was a djinn. Like a raven, but bigger, black as night with glowing red eyes I could see from where I stood. I'd never actually seen one before, but I knew them. Dark and mysterious creatures, they are, portents, according to legend. Very reclusive. I'd always been told they only come out at night, and if you see one on your path, it's a sure sign to turn right back round and run home, for the djinn is supposed to be a warning of horrible danger for those ye love. Well, when I saw that black creature rise up out of the trees, I was about to call out to the headmaster. But I knew he'd already seen it, and he didn't seem any too worried about it. So I just watched. That black bird flew right over, wheeling once above the garden and coming to land right on top of one of my pumpkins, right there next to the headmaster. And Merlin, he just watches it the whole time. The strangest thing was the way the two of and looked at each other. They didn't make any sounds, but it seemed to me plain as day that they was talking to each other somehow. After about a minute, that Jin looks over at me in that funny way that birds do, with their heads turned aside so one eye is pointing right at yet. That bright red eye stared me right down, and it was all I could do not to heave a rock at it like I was a scared kid. Hagrid looked imploringly at the 3 students at his table. "I loves magical creatures," he declared. "Dragons to scrooks. Yeah, lot know that as well as anyone. I teach care of magical creatures, fair goodness sakes. But that's the way that horrible bird made me feel. That glowing red eye just looked at me, and all I wanted was to put it out, make it so that it'd never look at anyone else ever again. It sent chills down me. Still does." Hagrid stopped and finally took a sip of his tea. He cleared his throat and went on. Finally, the thing took to flight again, flapping its great, greasy black wings. It flew back to the forest and disappeared. The headmaster watched it go, and then he walked back over to me, still tapping his staff on the ground. He gets next to me and turns back to the pumpkin patch, looking out over at the west corner. "You've been having a dead spell in that corner," he says to me. "Well, it's true'n, no Deneen. That west corner hasn't raised more 'n thorns and thistle for 5-6 years. So I have," I says to him. He looks me in the eye and says, "There's a fox who died with all her young, buried in her den under that corner of your garden, Mr. Hagrid. The dead spell arises from their bones, crying for a morning that'll never come. Dig them up, rebury them in the forest, and sprinkle the earth with sorrow-shot powder. Professor Heretofore can provide some, with my compliments. That will end your trouble." Rose's mouth was turned down in a grimace of dismay. "Did you do it, Hagrid?" Hagrid glanced up at her, raising his eyebrows. "Well, o' course I did. Found them bones, and no mistake. Did just as the headmaster said, right down to the sorrow-shot powder. And you can see plain as day that it did the trick. That corner has my biggest scorn squash in it. A fine, green tiger stripe variety. You've seen it, o' course. But the point is..." Hagrid stopped again and fiddled nervously with his teacup and saucer. He took another quick sip, as if to silence himself. "What, Hagrid?" Ralph asked, exasperated. "What's the point?" Hagrid looked at him, as if struggling with whether to speak. Finally, he leaned slightly over the table and said in a low voice, "The point is, it seems pretty plain to me that the djinn told the headmaster about that dead fox and E.R. Young. The point is, not only are all the old stories true about Merlin the Great talking to the trees and the birds. He even talks to the mystical creature birds of the night. If that great black bird had shown its red eyes in my presence any other time, I'd have turned on my heel and run. But Merlin, he watches the thing fly over almost as if he called it. Almost as if he knows it by its ruddy first name." James listened with his mouth pressed into a thin line. Finally, he straightened in his chair and said as plainly as he dared, "That doesn't mean he's evil." Hagrid blinked at him. "Well, of course not. Who said he was evil?" James was perplexed. "But you just said..." "Now hold on, James, and the rest of yet. I want to be clear," Hagrid said seriously. "All I'm saying is that the headmaster comes from a much different time, a time that would probably scare the hair off most of us. He lived in that time and worked in it. It's what he knows. Things that we would call evil and bad in this day and age, well, let's just say things weren't so black and white in the time he comes from. That isn't to say that the headmaster himself is bad. I've got every reason to trust him, and trust him I do. He's just a wee bit, well, wild. If you take my meaning. That's all." "But Hagrid," Rose exclaimed, "in the mirror. We saw him with that awful thing in the swirling black cloak. If that was the headmaster, Hagrid replied stubbornly, then he had a very good reason to be there. You said yourself, Rose, that none of you could hear what the man said. Maybe he was confronting them. Maybe he was. Well, I dunno, but the point is you dunno neither. That's what I've been saying all along, James said petulantly, glaring across the table at Rose. Fact is, Hagrid went on, none of you know the slightest bit about what you was seeing from start to end. You said Merlin told you that the mirror showed the past and the future as well as far-off places, didn't you? Maybe what you were seeing wasn't even from the here and now. Did you think o' that? Actually, Ralph said thoughtfully, no, we hadn't. But the gravesite? Rose insisted. That wasn't from a long time ago. Vold, he who must not be named, hasn't been dead all that long. But his grave was all covered with moss and vines, so it couldn't have been from the past. Let it go, Rose, Ralph shrugged. You might be right, but what would we do about it anyway? All we can do is hope Merlin's as good as his word, like Hagrid says. If he is, we don't have anything to worry about. If he's not, well, what are we going to do against a bloke that can make the earth open up and swallow whole armies? Rose fumed but didn't respond. A short while later, the trio finished their teas and bid Hagrid goodbye. As they left, James peered over into the west corner of the garden. Sure enough, a very large orange and purple-striped squash rested there on its bed of leaves, still glistening with last night's rain. I don't care what anyone says, Rose said gravely as they skirted the whomping willow. I don't trust him. He's not what he says he is. As much as I don't agree with Rose, Ralph answered, this whole thing does make our new defense club seem all the more important. How so? James asked. Well, it's obvious, isn't it? If what we saw in the mirror was true and was from the present day, then it means some really bad stuff might be coming. We might actually have an enemy to fight. I, for one, want to be ready for that. Ralph, Rose said in a different voice, if I didn't find you generally thick as a brick, I'd be impressed by that. Ralph blushed a little. Thanks, I guess. As they rounded a stand of bushes on the far side of the whomping willow, they ran into Noah, Damien, and Jennifer Tellis, the Ravenclaw gremlin. The three were crouched just out of range of the branches, studying the gnarled tree trunk. The branches of the willow shifted and twitched, sensing their presence but not quite able to reach them. Hey, Ralph called as they approached the hunkered gremlins, we got permission to start the new defense club, SHH. Noah hissed, raising a hand. Hold on a minute. James, Rose, and Ralph cracked up behind the three gremlins, who were rasping at each other tensely. A little lower, Damien hissed. It's the big one that looks like an Adam's apple on a really skinny bloke. Noah shook his head. We tried that one time before last. I keep telling you it's on the other side, facing away from the castle. I remember from last year, with Ted. Jennifer held a long stick. Biting her tongue in concentration, she held it out, reaching toward the tree trunk with the stick's tip. The tree leaned slightly and, almost lazily, whiplashed a branch at the stick. Jennifer exclaimed painfully as the stick was wrenched from her hand. It spun off into the thickets and the willow relaxed again, almost smugly. I told you to hold it lower. Noah exclaimed, stepping away from the tree and straightening. Look, you want to give it a go? Jennifer replied, looking back over her shoulder. Be my guest. But you'll need to go find yourself yet another stick. I can't help if you have longer arms than me, Noah proclaimed. It's not my fault you've got the reach of a gorilla. I've got another stick, Damien said patiently. Here, give it another go, Jen will hit it eventually. James watched as Jennifer reached carefully toward the tree trunk again. The willow swung its branches, feeling for the stick but not quite reaching it this time. James asked Noah, what's this all about? Secret passage, possibly, Noah answered, wiping moisture and grass clippings from his hands. We've been coming out and testing it every year since I first came. It was Ted's idea. Hit the right knot on the trunk and the tree goes tame enough to get inside. Rose's eyes brightened. It leads to a secret passageway? But I thought all the old secret passages had been sealed off? Well, they're sealed off and they're sealed off, Noah replied. Thing is, Hogwarts being as magical as it is, the passages have ways of opening back up on their own after a while. Either that or new ones get discovered nearby. Petra discovered the Locomogus passage just down the hall from the statue of the One-Eyed Witch, and that statue was supposed to lead to a secret passage back in your parents' day. I remember Mum talking about that one, Rose agreed. She said it went down to Hogsmeade. I was hoping that one still worked. I wanted to see Hogsmeade myself this year even though first years aren't allowed to go on Hogsmeade weekends. Hogsmeade, Noah sighed. Making miscreants out of model students for as long as I can remember. Ted works down there now at Weasley's. We plan on getting him to buy us butterbeers at the Triple Sticks when we go. All of us, except Petra, of course. What's going on with Petra? James asked, suddenly. Noah glanced at James. Oh, nothing major. She just doesn't want to go because she and Ted used to be a bit of an item. Apparently, it all came to an end when Ted started seeing Victoire. They kept it secret most of the summer, but now the whole world knows about it. Somebody blabbed about it back at King's Cross. I didn't blab. James exclaimed before he could stop himself. Ted told me to tell. He wanted to get the word out but didn't want to make a big thing of it. That was you? Jennifer said, peering back at James over her shoulder. James rolled his eyes. So that's what Petra's all upset about. She hasn't said so, Noah said, sighing. Who can tell? She and Ted were never all that serious, if you ask me. I admit I expected her to end it first, though. Ted's just a bit too wild for a girl like Petra. She needs a different kind of man. A man whose initials are NM, you think? Damien called, grinning. James felt his face heat. It bothered him that he might have inadvertently caused Petra's melancholy by revealing Ted and Victoire's relationship, even if Ted had asked him to do it. For some reason, it also bothered him that Noah might be interested in taking Ted's place. Nonchalantly, James asked Noah, what kind of man does a girl like Petra want? Noah shrugged. Well, Petra's smart. Smarter than most people know. She's going places. She needs a bloke who can hunker down and take life seriously with her. Ted, he's great and we all love him, but he's not the take life seriously type. Rose interjected, I heard Petra might get the part of Astra in the play. She'd be great for the role with her long dark hair and blue eyes. Noah nodded. If she can get her head around it. It's down to her and Josephina Bartlett, and Josephina really wants that part. It's just the thing Petra needs to get her mind off of Ted Lupin, Rose said emphatically. She's prettier than Josephina any day of the week. I'll help her prepare for the role, if I can. She has one more audition, doesn't she? Later this week, Noah agreed. I hope she gets it. I'm still hoping to land the part of Donovan. And Donovan and Astra get to dance, Damien sang mistily. That's nothing, Noah replied. Astra and True's kiss at the end of the play, and the script calls it the kiss of true and everlasting love. They won't really kiss, Rose said, shaking her head. In plays, they just press their cheeks together with their heads turned. The audience just thinks they're kissing. Close enough, for me, Noah muttered. How we doing with that secret knot, tell us? Don't hassle the maestro while she's working, Damien said, still hunkered down next to Jennifer. The willow was growing restless. Its trunk creaked ominously as it leaned, trying to lower its branches to walloping distance. Jennifer's stick weaved nervously near the leaning trunk. Ralph was looking apprehensively at the big, swaying tree. So you've already been down in the secret passage beneath the whomping willow. Where does it go? As of last year, nowhere, Noah admitted. It was all blocked off by a cave-in after a little way. That's why it never occurred to us to mark the secret knot still. It always seems like it'd have been a good idea when we come back the next year. We can't mark the knot, Jennifer said through gritted teeth. Otherwise, everyone would be able to use it. We have to just remember it. There. Jennifer jabbed the stick at the trunk, hitting a large knot near one of the tree's twisted roots. The tree suddenly straightened and went still. Come on, Noah cried, bolting toward the tree. We don't have long. James threw a look at Rose, then Ralph. Simultaneously, all three turned and ran toward the tree, following the three gremlins. Jennifer was the first to reach the trunk. She ducked and threw herself forward, disappearing into a deep crack between two enormous roots. Damien and Noah followed. James hoped there was room inside for 6, since he was the last in. As Ralph scrambled into the narrow space, James glanced up. He'd never been this close to the whomping willow before, and it looked huge and deadly as it loomed over him. As he watched, its branches began to move again. The trunk groaned ominously as it reanimated, angry, and looking for something to whomp. James ducked and threw himself into the crack between the roots just as a branch swung past him, buffeting him with its passage. Wow, Jennifer said, clambering up, 6 people with one knot push. I'd say that's a new record. Everybody, all right? I'll be fine when James gets off my back, Rose complained, grunting. Sorry, Rose. I didn't have time to look where I was landing. Noah lit his wand and held it up. The space was low, ceilinged with the massive roots of the whomping willow. A stone-walled passage led down into darkness. The gremlins began to descend it, followed closely by James, Rose, and Ralph. After about 30 paces, the group came to a halt. In the lead, Noah held his wand higher, whistling through his teeth. Eureka, Damien said excitedly. What? Rose exclaimed, standing on her toes to see over James' shoulder. I can't see. What is it? Hogwarts finds a way, Jennifer replied. It looks like there was a flood down here last spring. Washed a bunch of the dirt and gravel away. Look, there's room to squeeze through if you don't mind getting dirty. Excellent. Noah proclaimed, his voice echoing from further ahead. There was a distant splash. The passage beyond is completely intact. There's a little water to slosh through, and some seriously busy spiders, but the wand light scares them away. I'd guess this goes straight on through from here. Are we going now? Ralph asked. I didn't really come prepared for any journeys. Don't get anxious, Ralphinator, Noah answered, scrambling back around the former cave-in. We'll go the rest of the way later. It's just good to know the passageway's back open again. And we're the first to find it, Jennifer added. So don't you lot tell anyone, Damien finished, stabbing a finger in the air and looking severely at James, Rose, and Ralph. Especially you, Mr. Slytherin. Easy, Damascus, Noah said. Ralph's loyal to the gremlin cause. Come on, let's get back out of here. So where does the passage go to? Rose asked as they retraced their steps. Our best guess is that it goes to Hogsmeade, Jennifer answered. So you might get your wish about sneaking in a visit this year. The passage goes to Hogsmeade. Ralph replied, a bit irked about Damien's lack of confidence. Where does it come up? Couldn't somebody just trace it back to Hogwarts? Worried that your dad missed another weak spot in the schools security perimeter? Damien asked, smiling crookedly. Don't worry. Old Daddy Dollahoff's defensive perimeter is safe. Nobody will be coming back from the other side. Except us, hopefully. The passage doesn't go to Hogsmeade directly, Ralph, Noah said. They reached the bunker beneath the Whomping Willow. Carefully, Jennifer reached out and found the secret knock. The tree went still, and she scrambled out. So where does it go to, then? James asked as the group climbed quickly out of the secret opening. Our best guess is it goes to a delightful place called the Shrieking Shack, Damien said, stopping outside the perimeter of the tree. Nobody ever goes there. I can see why, Ralph nodded. Does it, shriek? No, it's just a name, Ralph, Jennifer said, clapping the big boy on the shoulder. It hasn't shrieked in decades. Although apparently it used to make quite a fuss, didn't it? Supposedly, the whole place shook. Ralph looked back at James and Rose. Are they making fun of me? Yeah, Ralph, James nodded. But it's all out of love. Don't sweat it. Ralph accepted that, and the three began to follow the gremlins back across the wet grass. As they reached the castle, he asked, so the Shrieking Shack didn't really use to shriek? James shook his head. I didn't say that, Ralph. I just said they were making a little fun of you. It's best if you don't ask any more about it. Rose concurred. Really, Ralph. Trust us. Ralph opened his mouth, considered it, and then closed it again. He sighed and the three students climbed the steps into the castle, following the smells of lunch. 8. The audition. The next day's defense against the dark arts class was slightly more bearable than previous classes, if only because they had a guest teacher's assistant. The assistant was possibly even more of a celebrity than DeBellows himself, since he was not only the new leader of the Harriers' Special Forces Squadron, but was also a former Bulgarian World Cup Quidditch player. Victor Crumb strode purposely into the gym as DeBellows introduced him, and the assembly of students applauded roundly. James knew Crumb very vaguely, having met him once or twice years earlier. Victor Crumb had, of course, competed in the Triwizard Tournament alongside James' dad, Aunt Fleur, and Cedric. During that time, he'd also had a short, romantic relationship with Aunt Hermione as well, to the extent that on the few occasions that Victor had been in the same room with the Weasley family, Aunt Hermione had tended to look in the other direction quite a lot, and Uncle Ron had puffed his chest out and adopted an attitude of noisy surliness. Victor spoke to the class in his irrepressible accent, telling them how he'd trained alongside Kendrick DeBellows in his early years in the Harriers, and assuring everyone that he wouldn't be where he was today if not for the man's leadership and example. James was almost immediately bored. He liked Victor quite a lot, but he disliked DeBellows enough that the sight of the man absorbing his protégé's praise made James a bit ill. The upshot was that there were no troops through the gauntlet that day, although DeBellows challenged Crumb to a manly contest to see which one of them could make it through first. Victor had turned down the challenge, and James liked to believe it was because the younger man simply hadn't wanted to shame his mentor. As the class wore on, James saw that Ralph, who was only slightly more artistic than James, was doodling an idea for the new Defense Club sign-up sheet. As they filed out of the gym and made their way to History of Magic, James said to Ralph, we really shouldn't be putting those up until we know we have a teacher. That's your job, Ralph shrugged. I have to do my part. Besides, you'll talk Cedric into it. You're good at that. Yeah, well, I haven't talked him into it yet. You'd best get on it, then, Rose said, meeting them at an intersection. The first meeting is tomorrow night. James nearly dropped his book. Tomorrow. Since when? Since I started spreading the word around the Great Hall at breakfast, Rose replied simply. I only meant to tell Henrietta Littlebite and Fiona Fourcompass, but you know how Fiona is. The whole Ravenclaw table was talking about it by the time I left. There's a lot of excitement about it. Nobody likes the way DeBellows is running DADA, even though it was sort of sweet to see Victor in the halls this morning. But we don't even know where we're meeting. James exclaimed. I thought we talked about starting things up at the end of next week. That was before we talked to the headmaster and saw what we saw in his mirror. Ralph's right. Things seem a bit more urgent now. Besides, Rose sniffed, stopping at the door to History of Magic. We agreed I was in charge of scheduling. Yeah, I suppose, but... The entire Ravenclaw table? Rose nodded. And Louis is spreading the word with the Hufflepuffs. Louis. James cried, raising his voice again. You got Louis involved? He overheard me, so I thought I'd put him to work. What's the matter? I thought you said that anyone who wanted could be involved. Yeah, well, James said, lowering his voice, anybody we wanted to know about it. I don't think it works that way, Ralph replied. Besides, word's all over the school by now. James exhaled in frustration, but it was too late to do anything about it. He'd have to go and find Cedric tonight if he could. Thinking that, he turned and shouldered his way into the crowded classroom where Professor Binns was already burbling away, his back to the students as he made ghostly notes on the illegible chalkboard. James finally had the opportunity he was waiting for that night after dinner. Ralph said goodnight at the stairs and Rose was in the library doing some homework. Once Ralph had descended into the cellars, James turned away from the stairway and walked along the main hall toward the portico. He felt rather strongly that he had to do this by himself. As he turned into the corridor that bore the trophy case, he slowed, looking around. There was no one about and the halls were quite silent as most of the students retired to their common rooms for the evening. James walked lightly along the display cases, passing the photos of ancient house Quidditch teams and displays of old game balls, plaques, and trophies. He paused for a moment in front of a Quidditch tournament trophy engraved with a list of names. It was rather old and tarnished, but the name near the bottom was still perfectly legible. James Potter, Chaser, it read in flowing script. Here was the name of the grandfather James had never known. He felt suddenly very sad because it reminded him that he had no grandfathers at all anymore. The plaque was rather dusty, probably forgotten by most everyone that moved daily through these halls. James had a strong urge to reach into the case and touch the plaque, as if to make sure it was real. It was like an anchor that connected him to a person and a time he'd never known. James glanced around the corridor, assuring himself no one was looking, and then stepped toward the case. The glass door squeaked slightly as he opened it. He reached in and ran a finger across the name engraved near the bottom, drawing a faint line in the dust. He could barely feel the etching of the letters. Suddenly, for no apparent reason, James thought of the words his father had said to him on the night of Granddad's funeral. Granddad is really the third father I've lost. I'm back to where I started. This name on the trophy was where everything started. This trophy is from those last few years before everything changed, James thought, before Grandma and Granddad were killed by Voldemort, before Dad's godfather, Sirius, was lost in the Hall of Mysteries. Before old Dumbledore was struck down on one of the roofs of this very castle, this was back before any of that had happened, when everybody was happy and nobody had had to die yet. If only. If only. I remember seeing your dad standing there in front of that very plaque, a voice said quietly. James wasn't surprised. He didn't turn around as he said, I came down here to look for you. I had a feeling this is where you came when you didn't know where else to go. This is the first place I remember being after I died, the ghostly voice of Cedric Diggory said. There was a long, long time of nothing, although it sometimes felt only like minutes. Finally, here I was, looking down at my own picture by the Triwizard Cup. I spent a lot of time doing that. It was comforting, in a way. I can't see myself in mirrors, You know, it's just one of the peculiarities of being a ghost. James closed the trophy case and turned to Cedric. You saw my dad standing here, looking at Granddad's name on the plaque. Cedric smiled at the memory. It wasn't just him. It was all three of them. Ron, Hermione, and Harry. It was their first year. I didn't know them then, but I knew who your father was. Everybody did. James looked back at the plaque again. It helped to know that his dad had also looked at that name and felt some of the same things he was feeling. He sighed. The past is a steel trap, Cedric said. Trust me on that one, James. James glanced up, as if in surprise. What? Cedric said. It wasn't that profound, was it? James shook his head. No. I mean, yeah, I guess, but that's not what I was thinking. I just had the strongest, weirdest feeling that this has happened before. And all of a sudden, I thought of Ralph's story. Cedric looked puzzled. James went on, waving a hand. It's this story that we learned about in Quizlet. Professor Revalvier says that all great magical stories were meant to be told by word of mouth because written words cage them and make them tame. Magical stories are meant to stay alive. They change with each retelling because they pick up the spirit of the teller. I don't know why, I just thought of the last line from the story Ralph told us in class. It's the only line I can ever get exactly right when I try to write it down. What is it? Cedric asked. James was thoughtful. Then I am the king of the cats, he said, as if tasting the words. Cedric's ghost was silent. After a moment, he asked, so what does it mean? That's just it, James said, shaking his head. It doesn't seem to mean anything unless I'm not thinking about it. Then, all of a sudden, it'll pop into my head, just like it did now, and it'll seem really important. I just can't put my finger on it. It's like seeing something out of the corner of your eye, something that vanishes as soon as you look right at it. Well, I guess if it really is important, it'll come to you when you need it, Cedric said, shrugging. You said you came down here looking for me? So, James replied, shaking himself. Yeah. ER. He sighed, and then looked the ghost right in his semi-transparent eye. We need your help, said. I don't know how else to put it. We're putting together this club, Ralph and Rose and me. Actually, it was Noah, Sabrina, and Damien's idea, but we're the ones that went to Merlin and got permission and everything. Honestly, we're not even the first people to do it. My dad had a club like this way back in his day, although it was after you know, ER. Anyway, we need to learn how to do defensive spells and techniques, and our new teacher this year refuses to teach us anything except how to pull a hamstring. We've got permission to officially start the club, and by now, it seems like the whole school already knows about it. Our first meeting's tomorrow, but we don't even have a teacher. That's why I came to find you. When we first talked about it, you were the first person that Ralph, Rose, and I thought of to teach us defensive magic. You can't be serious, Cedric said, smiling a little crookedly. I'm a ghost, if you haven't noticed. Not only do I not have a working wand anymore, technically, I don't even have fingers. I couldn't stun a dust bunny. I have a hard enough time magicking the lanterns out when I do my Spectre of Silence routine. And you think I can teach defensive, magical technique? Well, yeah, James said, warming to the subject. I mean, you were a great wizard, even while you were still in school. Everybody says so. Even Victor Crumb talks about how you outwitted the dragon and took on the mare people. You were a natural. Besides, you have actual battle experience, having been all through the Triwizard Tournament. And you learned under Dumbledore, who everybody says was the golden age of Hogwarts. Come on, Cedric. It's perfect. I don't think so, James, Cedric said, his smile fading. It's great that you thought to ask me and all, but... Look, Cedric, this isn't just for us, James said, stepping a bit closer to the ghost. You said you didn't think there was a place for you here anymore. All your old friends and classmates have moved on. But there are a whole bunch of us who really do need you, here and now. My dad says you were totally excellent with your spell work and technique, and everybody knows you were a natural leader. I know you still remember it all because ghosts don't experience time the same way the living do. Come on, what do you say? Cedric's ghost was flitting backwards, his face downcast as he shook his head. I can't, James. Part of me would really like to do it, but I can't. You wouldn't understand. Look, Ced, just try it for a week or two. It'll be great. Everyone will love you, and I just know you'll be able to teach us loads of stuff. Besides, James faltered, not sure if he should go on. Cedric stopped and looked back at him. James took a deep breath and continued. Remember the end of last year, that night when we talked in the Gryffindor common room? You told me there was a sense of Voldemort still in the halls here, even though he was dead. Well, Rose and Ralph and me, we saw something. And I've been sensing things. Something's up, and it has something to do with the old Death Eaters, and Voldemort's grave, and some really scary creature in a cloak that looks like it's made out of swirling smoke and ash. Rose even thinks that the headmaster is involved, although I don't agree. What I'm trying to say is that there could be a battle coming. DeBellows isn't teaching us anything worth using in a real magical fight. We just want to be prepared. We want to be ready. You're from the time when Voldemort was still alive. You know how best to fight these people. You're perfect, and we need you. Cedric looked at James for a long, tense moment. He seemed to be struggling with himself. Finally, he lowered his brow and looked away. You're right about one thing, James. I did have experience with battle. I was killed in my first one. I lasted a total of 10 seconds. James was flabbergasted. Said, you can't mean that. That night in the graveyard. That wasn't a battle. I've heard Dad talk about it. He was there, remember? Pettigrew shot you with no warning. You can't, seriously, think. Really, James, Cedric said, looking up. The ghost's eyes were very grave. Don't ask me again. I have my reasons. I can't, all right? James met the ghost's gaze. After a moment, he sighed deeply. All right, Cedric. Forget it. Sorry to bother you. See you around. James turned and began to plod away. He got halfway down the corridor when Cedric's voice said, Does it hurt? James stopped in his tracks and narrowed his eyes. He glanced back over his shoulder. Does what hurt? Cedric hadn't moved. He hovered near the trophy case, looking solemnly at James. The mark on your forehead. James' heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, he touched the place where he'd felt the itch and the strange dart of pain outside the headmaster's office. You can see it, he whispered harshly. Cedric nodded slowly. What? James began, but his voice failed him. He cleared his throat. What does it look like? Cedric's expression didn't change. He knew James knew. It looks like a lightning bolt, James. Just like your father's. Except it's green. It glows a little. James' eyes were wide and his heart pounded. The spot on his forehead felt warm. It tingled a little now that he thought about it. He looked helplessly up at Cedric again. Don't worry, Cedric said, sensing James' question. I don't think anyone else can see it. Apart from the other ghosts, maybe. It's only been there for a week or so. At first, it was very faint, but now That's why I asked if it hurt. James' thoughts were whirling. What could it mean? Why was it happening? It does hurt, sometimes, James admitted. But just a little. Mostly, it just itches. Except for one time, right outside the headmaster's office. Merlin looked at me, and it stung. But just for a second. Cedric nodded once, solemnly. Pay attention to it, James. It must be there for a reason. But be careful. It might not be trustworthy. James nodded, barely hearing. He glanced around quickly, just to make sure no one had approached and heard the conversation. The corridor was still empty. When he looked up again, Cedric's ghost had vanished. Cedric? James whispered. There was no response. James couldn't be sure whether the ghost had truly left, or just gone invisible. Cedric, if you're still there, and you change your mind. Well, you know where to find me, right? The corridor was utterly still and silent. James touched his forehead again, wonderingly and worryingly. Finally, he sighed, turned, and began to trudge back toward the staircases and the Gryffindor common room. As soon as James reached the common room, he told Rose about his meeting with Cedric. She was surprisingly understanding about the ghost's refusal to teach the class, remembering the conversation they'd had in the corridor a week earlier. He'll probably come around, she said, nodding. We'll just need to find somebody else in the meantime. It's fine, really. None of the students we talked to today knew anything about Cedric anyway. But who can we get to teach in the meantime? James fretted. People will be coming tomorrow with some expectations, Rose. We can't just tell them to open their defense textbooks and start trying out whatever spells they feel like. It'd be a complete mess. Rose looked thoughtful. We could ask Victor, maybe. He's going to be here until the end of next week. He certainly knows his stuff. He's too tight with DeBellows, James said. He'd tell him first off and we'd never hear the end of it. Rose had been scanning the room idly. Suddenly, her eyes widened. She glanced back at James, a crooked smile curling her lip. There is one person already among us who seems to know a good bit of defensive magic. The older years don't want to do it, James sighed. We've already been through it with them, Rose. Actually, Rose said, looking askance again, the person I was thinking of is a year younger than you. James followed the direction of his cousin's gaze. Scorpius Malfoy sat at a table across the room, idly flipping pages in a textbook. He glanced up, noticing James' gaze, and sneered slightly. Not in 1,000 years, Rose, James said flatly, turning back and crossing his arms. Not in 1,000,000 years. I'm just saying, Rose said innocently, you said he was using stunning spells on the train against Albus. And the other second years have been talking about what he did to your headboard, which is, you have to admit, pretty impressive. He knows levitation already, and... No, Rose. James hissed, interrupting. I'll take a term of DeBellows and the gauntlet before I'll ask him to teach me anything. Are you willing to speak for the rest of the club's members, too? He's not a teacher. He's a stuck-up prat. He probably wouldn't even do it if we asked him. People like him aren't exactly the sharing type. Rose smoothed her robes primly. Well, you can't know unless you try. Really, James. Do we want a teacher or not? James shook his head. We want a teacher, not a smug little twit who's learned a few tricks. If you want him to teach, you ask him. I might just do that, Rose replied breezily. She collected her bag and walked away. James watched her, but she merely climbed the stairs to the girls' dormitories. If she meant to ask Scorpius to teach the new defense club, she apparently wasn't planning on doing it tonight. After a while, James climbed the stairs on the opposite side of the room. As he got ready for bed, he thought carefully about the conversation he'd had with Cedric's ghost. He should have known that Cedric would refuse to leave the club, and yet it really had seemed like part of Cedric wanted to do it. And what could it possibly mean that Cedric was seeing a glowing green lightning bolt scar on James' head? As James finished brushing his teeth in the tiny washroom, he leaned in, examining himself in the mirror. As far as he could see, his forehead was completely unmarked. And yet, even now, he could feel that tiny, telltale tingling. Often, James had seen people pointing at his father, recognizing him by the famous scar, and James had thought it would be cool to have such a mark. Back then, James hadn't understood the price his dad had paid for that scar. Even now, he couldn't completely understand it, but he understood it enough, especially now that he'd lost Grandfather Weasley. He knew enough not to want such a thing for himself anymore. For a while last year, James had struggled with expectations of following in the footsteps of his famous father. Now, James knew those footsteps were far too big for him. More importantly, James had his own path to travel, and it was unique to him. It wasn't just a replay of what his father had done. He'd learned that lesson, hadn't he? So why was he experiencing this phantom lightning bolt scar? What was it trying to tell him? And could he trust it? There was no point in worrying about it. And yet it was hard to let it go. Eventually, as he climbed into his bed, James distracted himself by trying to think of someone else who might possibly serve as teacher for the new defense club. He couldn't think of anyone, and he certainly wasn't going to ask Scorpius, but it did take his mind off the mysterious tingling on his forehead. Finally, eventually, James drifted to sleep. There were voices, echoing indistinctly, or perhaps it was only one voice, but the echoes made it sound like more. James couldn't understand any of the actual words, but the sound of the voice was both soothing and maddening, like scratching a poison ivy rash. It was dark, but there were flashes of something, like glints of light on the edges of blades scything the air. Beneath the voice was the clank and rumble of ancient machinery and a tinkling of water, all echoing disorientingly. Footsteps rattled on stone and the voice grew closer. James could hear words, but they were disconnected and strange. Light bloomed, flickering as if through water. It was green, and there were faces in it. A man and a woman, beckoning, smiling sadly, hopefully. "James, you're dreaming, you big div, wake up." A bag of laundry whumped James' head and he jerked upright, blinking. "It's about time," Gran muttered sleepily. "I've been trying to get you awake for a solid minute. You always talk in your sleep." James looked blearily at Graham. "How would I know," he muttered grumpily, "if I do it when I'm asleep?" The dream circled his head like a swarm of gnats, but he couldn't remember much of it. Dawn light seeped into the room as Graham slid out of bed. "Well, we might as well get up anyway," Graham said. "I can smell bacon all the way up here. Let's go get a plateful before Hugo gets down there and wolfs it all." The day brightened to a wonderfully warm autumn afternoon. The morning's classes droned by and James hardly noticed, distracted in turns by thoughts of the previous night's strange dream, fretting about who could lead that afternoon's first defense club meeting. And Cedric's worrying words about the phantom scar on his head. At some point, James connected the dream with the scar, remembering that his father's scar had once been a sort of gateway into the thoughts of Voldemort. But Voldemort was long since dead. His father's scar hadn't hurt him in 2 decades. Whatever the phantom sign on James' forehead meant, it couldn't be a link to any resurgent Dark Lord, for his dad would surely have felt it first. Unless, James thought with a start, it was connecting him to the bloodline, the secret successor of Voldemort that the tree sprite had told him about last year. James shuddered as he knelt on the grass at Hagrid's Care of Magical Creatures class. How could he possibly be connecting to the bloodline? His father, Harry Potter, was the one with the scar, not James. Why him? Your father's battle is over, the tree sprite had said. Yours begins. James, Hagrid said, glancing at him over the other students. Something wrong with your den? James looked down at the muddy, slimy mess in front of his knees. He plunged a hand into it, feeling for the mucus eel he'd just planted. No, it's great, Hagrid. Slimy as can be. Really, it's great. This is completely repulsive, Ralph said, mucking his hand in his own excavation. It slocked and slurped disgustingly. Suddenly, he lunged and pulled, yanking the tail of his mucus eel out of the muck. Very good, Hagrid called heartily. Ralph's gut is turned upright. As soon as the eel's face down in its den, it goes limp. Just rub its belly nice and slow. That'll make it hibernate. Then we can harvest the eel's slime. Very useful stuff, mucus eel slime. Graham grimaced and flung ropes of slime from his fingers. So is this thing a plant or an animal, Hagrid? Well, what class are you in, Mr. Warden? Hagrid asked in reply. Care of magical creatures, Graham answered in a monotone. Then since this isn't Professor Longbottom's herbology class, Hagrid said, grinning, I suppose you can assume the slime eel is a magical creature with some unusual planty tendencies, can't you? Professor Hagrid. Morgan Petunia suddenly called, struggling to keep her voice even. I think I pulled my eel too hard. Everyone looked. Morgan had leapt to her feet and was holding her mucus eel at arm's length, cringing away from the flailing, meter-long creature. Fans of greenish slime flew from the eel, splattering Morgan's robes and the ground beneath it. Don, let ER go. Hagrid cried, throwing up his hands. Lower ER back to ER den, but Don, let go. She'll wriggle down to the lake and we'll never see ER again, and those eels are right, dear. Just lower ER carefully headfirst into the den, that's the way, Miss Petunia. Ralph watched Morgan dip the wriggling eel back to the mess of slimy dirt. Her face was a mask of utter disgust. The eel's arrow-shaped head touched the mud, and the body lunged forward, trying to burrow into the den. There yet, though, then, Hagrid sighed, relaxing. No harm done. A good lesson for us all, in fact. Keep the head in the den. Better safe than sorry, Miss Petunia? Morgan smiled gaily, looking as if she was, in fact, plenty sorry. Slime glistened in rope as slashes across her robe. Before I found out I was a wizard, Ralph said wistfully, staring at Morgan's robes, I was planning to attend the Byron Brugman School for Boys. I bet they don't do anything with mucus eels there. Just think what you'd be missing, Graham said, smiling ruefully. He flipped a fingerful of slime at Ralph. Later that day, James was making his way through the crowded halls, glancing surreptitiously around, as if worried he was being followed. The afternoon free period had been co-opted by Professor Curry's drama auditions, and James was on his way to the Muggle Studies classroom. At a cross corridor, James met Rose and Ralph, who were talking animatedly. What are you two doing? James asked, stopping and glancing at each one in turn. Well, I was coming to watch Petra audition for the role of Astra, Rose replied, if that's all right with you, cousin. And I'm just going along because the alternative is to go start my charms homework, Ralph replied. Rose says she'll help me with it if I wait until tonight. It's a no-brainer. What about you? Me? James said, his voice squeaking guiltily. Nothing. Really. I just. Same reason. Come on, let's go then. As they entered the Muggle Studies classroom, James' face was beet red. He walked quickly to the front of the classroom, hoping Ralph and Rose wouldn't follow him. He angled into the second row, and was annoyed to see that both of them were filing in after him. What's with you, James? Rose asked, sitting down and frowning at him curiously. Did you find a place for the defense club to meet? James replied, changing the subject. Yeah, Rose said slowly, still studying James' face. The gymnasium isn't being used in the evenings, so I've gotten us permission to meet there. It's all taken care of. The gym? Ralph moaned. I hate that place. That's where DeBellows has his class. Is that all you could find? It's the perfect meeting place, Rose replied stiffly. There are no tables or chairs to get in the way, and there are already plenty of targets for spell practice. And eventually, if we begin conducting practice duels, the padded floors will be very helpful. Are you sure duels are a good idea? Ralph asked. I mean, James did tell the headmaster we wouldn't be practicing on each other. Duels are essential to proper defensive technique, Rose said, rolling her eyes. You can't get any good shooting spells at non-moving targets. Besides, I'd rather the headmaster not know the extent of our training. He might try to shut us down. James scowled. Rose, that's ridiculous. Merlin would probably be happy that we're learning real magical battle techniques. Oh. Then why'd he hire DeBellows in the first place? Rose asked, raising her eyebrows. Merlin's not in charge of those kind of decisions, James replied, but uncertainly. My mum and your dad both work at the ministry, James. We both know that the headmaster has final verdict about faculty. Besides, Merlin isn't the kind of man to let other people make decisions for him. DeBellows is here because Merlin wants him here. Ralph said, that doesn't mean he's trying to keep us from learning anything useful. No, Rose agreed easily. But if he was, DeBellows is a great way to make sure we didn't. And after what we saw in the mirror, I'd rather not take any chances. James opened his mouth to argue with Rose, but at that moment, Professor Curry stood and cleared her throat. Thank you all so much for coming, she trilled. These auditions aren't mandatory class times, so I take it as a sign of healthy interest in our production that so many of you have come to observe. Of course, this is not exactly how auditions are conducted in the Muggle Theatre, but in the interests of education, we've chosen a rather more public casting format. Today, we'll be completing auditions for the role of Astra, Truce, King Julian, and the Marsh Hag. Final decisions will be made by myself and the elected representatives from the major theater departments. Let's show some appreciation for the head of the props department, Mr. Jason Smith, the director of the costume shop, Miss Jennifer Tellis, the head of the stage crew, Mr. Hugo Paulson, and finally, my official production assistant and associate director, Miss Tabitha Corsica. The four representatives were seated at a long table arranged in a front corner, positioned at an angle so that it faced both the classroom and the area designated as the audition stage. The four students accepted the round of half-hearted applause, nodding and smiling. Hugo stood and threw his arms wide, as if accepting an award. He bowed deeply and Jennifer Tellis yanked him back into his seat, rolling her eyes. At the end of the table, Tabitha smiled inscrutably. Briefly, she made eye contact with James and winked. James frowned at her. First up, Professor Curry said, consulting a sheaf of parchment in her hand, we will be viewing the final two candidates for the role of Astra. Miss Josephina Bartlett, 7th year, Ravenclaw, will read first. Please, as always, silence from the gallery is appreciated. That means no applause, thank you. Miss Bartlett, whenever you are ready. Josephina Bartlett virtually pranced to the front of the room, her robes bouncing around her and her long blonde hair catching the sunlight from the windows. Thank you, all of you, and particularly the parts committee, Josephina said, smiling winningly. Whomever you choose, this has been a wonderful opportunity for me and all of the other candidates. Just read, Josephina, Jennifer said, arching an eyebrow. Josephina cranked her grin a notch higher, glaring at Jennifer, then suddenly dropped her arms and head as if she'd been switched off. She took a deep breath, apparently staring at the floor between her feet. Then, slowly, she raised her head. Her eyes were glistening. She stared out over the assembled students, a look of beatific anguish etched onto her face. "Behold," she exclaimed, raising her arm so fast that her sleeve flopped. She pointed straight ahead. Sitting at the committee table, Hugo actually looked to see what Josefina was pointing at. Jennifer nudged him in the ribs with her elbow. Josefina drew a huge, shuddering breath. "Be that the waning sun to light my love's returning sail, or are my eyes deceived by heart's desire? If 't be that now he lies at ocean's deepest grave, then ne'er permit my soul to wake, nor fervid dreams to pass. 'T is better laid in slumber's crypt than 't walk in living death, the world, my hell, without dear truths. Hark, my heart, from plight to break, it must. O truths, is 't thee? State thy coming now, or let me join thy bed and sleep in dreary death. But daren't restrain my soul to waiting anguish. Truths, make thy answer known, or bid my soul depart, to flee to everlasting sleep, to death." Josefina fell silent, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. Her lip quivered minutely. Then, suddenly, her face cleared. She wiped the tear away with her sleeve and smiled at the gallery. There was a collective exhale. Even James had been holding his breath. Rose glanced over at him, annoyed. James shrugged and Rose rolled her eyes. "Nicely done, Miss Bartlett," Curry said from her seat at the table. "Perhaps a bit, melodramatic, but certainly quite evocative." Any comments from the table? Hugo's face was screwed up with concentration. "What's fervid mean?" Jennifer sighed, and then turned to Josefina. "You've obviously practiced, Jo, and it shows. Nice preparation." "Tell me," Tabitha said, lowering her eyes to the tabletop and furrowing her brow, "were you attempting to present Astra as sad and forlorn, or are we to believe that she has just experienced a complete frontal lobotomy?" Josefina's smile went brittle. "Take it however you want, Tabitha. I don't think anyone else shares your, professional interpretation." "I'm not sure that matters exactly," Tabitha said sweetly, meeting Josefina's eyes. "If you wanted the part," Josefina said, dropping her smile, "then you should be auditioned for it. Otherwise, let those few who know how to act do their job." "Point noted, Miss Bartlett," Curry said quickly. "Please feel free to return to your seat. Now, also reading, for the part of Astra, we have Petra Morgenstern, 7th year, Gryffindor. Miss Morgenstern, are you prepared for your reading?" Petra rose from her seat at the back of the room. James turned to watch her approach the stage area. She had the script with her, and as she turned to face the gallery, she consulted it. Her lips moved as she read the first lines. "I tried to practice with her," Rose whispered to James, "but she said she wanted to do it fresh, with no rehearsing. I swear, she's hardly even read the whole script yet." Petra lowered the script again and coughed into her fist. Finally, she looked out over the crowd of students, her face almost blank but for a very slight furrowing of her brow. There was almost 10 seconds of silence, and James was worried that Petra had already forgotten her lines. Finally, almost in a whisper, Petra said the first word of the reading, "Hark." The entire room seemed to lean forward as Petra recited the lines, quietly, thoughtfully, as if to herself. Her voice rose only to normal speaking volume as she reached the end. "O truths, is 't thee," she said, and her voice was full of doubt, as if she knew Astro's hope was as frail as tissue. "State thy coming now, or let me join thy bed and sleep in dreary death." She paused, and her voice dropped again, to just above a whisper. "Truths, make thy answer known, or bid my soul depart. To flee to everlasting sleep. To death." Petra stopped, her face still wearing the same expression she'd begun with. She seemed to be looking through the back wall at something very far off, like a mirage. Then, without a glance at the committee table, she tucked the script under her arm and walked back down the center aisle. James watched her until she returned to her seat. "Very nice, Miss Morgenstern," Professor Curry said. "A bit soft for the stage, but we can work on the histrionics when the time comes." "She missed the second part," Josephina muttered from her seat. There didn't seem to be any comments from the table. Curry stood, producing her sheaf of parchments again and adjusting her spectacles. "Next, we have final readings for the part of Trues. We've narrowed the candidates to some of the younger years, since Trues is meant to be the younger of Astra's two suitors." James' face burned. He'd never told Ralph or Rose that he'd signed up for the part of Trues. His first reading had gone fairly well, although it had only been Professor Curry and a few first years at that initial audition. He didn't even know who else was in line for the part. He glanced over at Rose and Ralph. "I need to tell you something," he whispered urgently. "SHH." Rose hissed. "Only 2 candidates remain for the role of Trues," Curry was saying. "One is from Slytherin and the other is from Gryffindor, but ironically, both are from the same family. First up, in order of first names since they both have the same last name," Curry smiled indulgently and took off her spectacles. "First year, Slytherin, Albus Potter." Simultaneously, James, Ralph, and Rose's mouths dropped open. Rose and Ralph turned toward James, but James spun in his seat, looking for his brother. Albus jumped to his feet and jogged to the front of the room, throwing a smile and a shrug in James' direction. James couldn't believe it. Albus, in a play? Of course, it wasn't any more surprising than James himself trying out for a play, but still. So this had been the meaning of Tabitha's sly wink from the committee table. She'd probably put Albus up to it, just to cause a rift between the two brothers. And Albus was letting her succeed in the attempt. James fumed angrily in his seat. "You little toonk," Rose rasped, elbowing James. "Why didn't you tell us?" "I tried," James replied, still watching his brother hop onto the stage area. 10 seconds ago. Albus had apparently memorized his reading. He'd cleared his throat, and then glanced aside at the committee table. "Am I supposed to say anything?" he asked brightly. "This is only my second time trying out for a play. Am I supposed to thank the Academy or something first?" "That comes rather later, Mr. Potter," Curry said, smiling indulgently. "Just read the lines, please. At your leisure." Albus nodded. To James' eye, his brother didn't look the slightest bit nervous. He bobbed on the balls of his feet a little, and then flung out his hands, as if encompassing the room. "Foul Donovan," he cried, his face darkening. "That great Rouse malcontent had been their room amongst my thoughts for more than Eros' spell and vanity. I might have seen thy wicked plot afoot. My sinister and foolish pride did make me bathe thy oily tongue, and dreams of fame to take this quest of doom, and now I lie so far removed an obstacle to vile and vicious victory. O Astra, wife of mine at heart, reverse my sails, and send a wind to turn us north, we still may beat that villain's storm. To arms, we'll take, O men, to bear the force of righteous truth, the spear to pierce his lying heart. But spite, his clouds have blocked the sun, and time hath turned to foe. Wizards and men, forth draw ye wands and wits to fight the violent seas this night, that by the morn we'll hold our win, or lie in beds of ocean sand, our beaten glory's shrine." Albus finished his rousing speech with a triumphant cry, shaking an invisible wand at the sky. There was a scattering of laughter and a few whoops of hearty encouragement. This speech was, after all, a classic rallying cry in the wizarding world. A few brave observers had even recited the last line alongside Albus, grinning and shaking their own invisible wands. "Thank you, Mr. Potter," Curry called loudly, stifling the outbursts. Very spirited, but not exactly as grave as one might expect. The soldiers are not embarking on a Quidditch match. They are facing the likelihood of their own doom. One might expect their leader to be a bit less glib. Still though, very enthusiastically performed. Please return to your seat. Curry didn't need to consult her parchments. As Albus retreated to his seat, grinning and accepting high fives from some of his friends, Curry looked directly at James. And now, also reading for the role of Trues, the elder Potter, James. Second year, Gryffindor. Whenever you are ready, Mr. Potter, the stage is all yours. James felt stuck to his seat. He forced himself to stand, and then sidled past Rose and Ralph. By the time he got to the stage, his mind was a complete blank. He'd memorized the audition lines, but now, distracted by Albus' surprise performance, he couldn't even think of the first word. He glanced over at the committee table and grinned sheepishly. Professor Curry nodded encouragement. Tabitha was smiling smugly, obviously enjoying James' discomfort. A spark of anger flared in James as he looked at that grin, and with that anger, he remembered the first two words of his lines. Foul Donovan, James said, turning to look out at the gallery. His eyes met Albus, and his anger increased. It smoldered in his words as he delivered them through partially gritted teeth. That great Rouse malcontent had been their room amongst my thoughts for more than Eros spell and vanity. I might have seen thy wicked plot afoot. As the words came, James allowed his own resentment to fuel them. His voice rose, and he even allowed himself to look askance at Tabitha. He was grimly pleased to see she was no longer smiling. Wizards and men, forth draw ye wands and wits, James said, as if relishing the idea of a fight. To fight the violent seas this night, that by the morn will hold our win, or lie in beds of ocean sand, our beaten glory's shrine. Rose erupted into applause. Ralph and a few others joined her, but they were quickly quelled by a warning look from Professor Curry. Very impassioned, I must say, Mr. Potter, Curry said appreciatively. I'm not sure where you found your motivation, but I dare say it was quite effective. Ahem. You may take your seat. Next up, we have Miss Ashley Doone, second year, Gryffindor, reading for the part of the Marsh Hag. Miss Doone, you have the stage. Ashley approached the stage in character, hunched over and lurching. She reached the stage, paused, and then spun around, shrieking hoarsely and hooking her fingers into claws. James, seating himself rather triumphantly in the front row, had to suppress a grin. That was spectacular, Rose whispered into his ear. I wouldn't have thought you had it in you. You were the one who told me I should try out for the part, James whispered back. Yeah, well, I was just being polite, Rose admitted. But I'm glad I did. That was really amazing. I had goosebumps. 20 minutes later, the assembly filed out of the Muggle Studies classroom. James followed Rose and Ralph into the corridor and stopped, his eyes wide. Don't act so surprised, Rose said, clapping him on the shoulder. You were brilliant. You deserve the part. But I'm not an actor, James said, looking at her a bit wildly. It's a bit late to worry about that little detail, Ralph grinned. Albus shouldered through the crowd and approached his brother. Yeah, well, I didn't really want to be up on stage anyway, he said, spreading his arms. Have fun making lovey eyes at Josephina. Don't remind me, Rose said emphatically. I can't believe they chose her over Petra. I thought she did pretty well, Ralph commented, looking up at the ceiling. You think she looked pretty well, that's all, Rose replied, shaking her head. I can see right through you, Ralph Deedle. That's not true, Ralph said defensively. Well, I mean, it is true, but that's not why I think she deserves the part. Tabitha stepped out of the classroom and spied Albus. She smiled and walked over toward the group. Congratulations, James. Inspiring performance. It's good to see you and Albus aren't too competitive about such things. Get stuffed, Corsica, James said, turning away. Don't try to act happy that we aren't at each other's throats. Tabitha looked mournfully at James, but Albus' face darkened. What the bloody hell is wrong with you, James? You act like Tabitha has it in for us. I'll bet you don't even know that she voted for you to get the part. And I agreed with her. So why don't you just back off a little, eh? James wheeled on his brother, but another voice called out before he could respond. Tabitha didn't vote for me, but I still got the part, Josephina said. She smiled at Tabitha from where she stood, surrounded by a gaggle of exulting Ravenclaw girls. Score 1 for full frontal lobotomy, score 0 for Tabitha's professional interpretation. The girls giggled as Josephina batted her eyes, and then turned to walk away. Tabitha seemed as unruffled as always, but she'd also forgotten about James. She swept into the throng without looking back, apparently following Josephina and her entourage. Albus threw a rankled look at James and stalked away as well. I'm going to go find Petra, Rose said, shaking her head in disgust. She's sure to be disappointed about losing the part. I'll see the two of you in the gym after dinner. Don't forget. We won't, Ralph replied, annoyed. For the last half an hour, I'd completely forgotten about that drat club meeting, James mourned, turning to follow the rest of the departing students toward dinner in the Great Hall. Don't worry about it, Ralph said happily. What's a little defense club meeting to the great truths, conqueror of the Castincy? 9. The Lady of the Lake. James sat with Graham and Hugo at dinner, letting most of the conversation drift over him as he concentrated on how best to manage the defense club meeting. Rose had eaten quickly and gone ahead to make sure the gym was ready for them, and Ralph was busy collecting the names of everyone who'd expressed interest in being involved. The list had grown rather long, and James' trepidation about the class had grown with it. Even though he was sharing responsibility for the class with Ralph and Rose, he couldn't help feeling that the club members would look to him as the symbolic leader of the troop. Finally, having barely eaten, James left the table. It wouldn't hurt for him to get to the gym a little early as well, and it would probably be comforting to be around Rose anyway. She seemed positively casual about the entire affair. James suspected that her Weasley heritage rather enjoyed the giddy uncertainty and potential for disaster. As he left the Great Hall, James felt a nagging, anonymous worry. It was as if he was forgetting something important, but he couldn't identify what it might be. Even as he moved through the halls and corridors, there was a sense of anxious anticipation in the air. Students moved in groups, obviously engrossed in spirited conversation, awaiting the evening's events. James sighed nervously and turned the corner toward the gym. There you are, Rose said, as if she'd expected James hours ago. The gym is almost ready. There are already people waiting outside in the hall. We just need to roll up the floor pads and wheel in one of the chalkboards. Why do we need a chalkboard? James asked. Rose gave him an impatient glance. So we can write down the spells and hexes we practice. It'll be a lot easier for people to concentrate if they don't have to memorize the incantations on the spot. There's a chalkboard on casters over in the charms classroom, next hall over. Go and wheel it in here, and we'll be ready to get started. Annoyed at being ordered around, but glad of the distraction, James turned around and left the gym. Sure enough, students were gathering in the hall outside. They leaned against the wall and sat on the floor in loose groups, all of them looking up as James came out. We'll, start in just a few minutes, James said, trying to put some authority into his voice. Nearby, Cameron Creevy grinned and waved. A gaggle of first years stood with him, their eyes wide and excited. James blinked at the gathering students. There was a good number of them, although not as many as he'd expected. He should have been relieved, but he wasn't. That nagging worry crept over him again. What was he forgetting? James worked his way around to the next corridor, which was darker and completely deserted. He got to the charms classroom and found it unlocked. The chalkboard stood on a wooden frame in the corner. Tiny metal wheels were attached to the bottom. James grabbed the end of the frame and began to pull, but the wheels were rusty. They squealed and dragged on the floor. From the doorway, a voice asked, "Do you require some assistance, Mr. Potter?" James spun as if he'd been caught doing something illegal. Merlin stood in the doorway, almost completely blocking it. His form was very shadowy in the dim room. James began, surprised that he felt so nervous. After all, they had permission to hold the club meeting, didn't they? And yet he felt a strong reluctance to tell the headmaster what he was doing. "I'm just trying to move the chalkboard. We wanted to borrow it. To make some notes." Merlin nodded inscrutably. "How are preparations for your defensive techniques club coming along, James?" James' heart quickened. Good. Fine. We've been pretty busy, you know. But good. Would you like some assistance with that?" Merlin asked in his low, rumbling voice. "I'd be happy to help you relocate it to wherever you wish. If anyone wondered what you were up to, I could vouch for your borrowing it." "No, thanks," James said quickly, letting go of the chalkboard. "Actually, we probably don't really need it. It was just an idea, but it's not worth the trouble." "Really?" Merlin didn't move for a long moment. Finally, he seemed to relax and smile. "As you wish, James." The big man turned to leave, and James felt a huge, strange sense of relief as Merlin's gaze left him. The club would just have to do without the chalkboard, James determined. He crossed the darkened classroom and was nearly to the door when Merlin turned back, his eyes glittering in the dark corridor. "Honestly, I didn't expect you to be inside tonight, James," the big wizard said curiously. James didn't quite know how to respond. "No? Where did you expect me to be?" "Tonight is rather an important night for many students. I understand that even those who do not intend to participate rather enjoy watching the proceedings. They like to get a sense of how the season might progress." A sudden sinking sensation filled James. His cheeks went cold. "Oh no," he said, widening his eyes. "It's tonight. That's why there were fewer people than I expected in the hall. It's already started. Is it possible that you forgot?" Merlin said, a strange smile creeping over his face. "I assumed you were quite the fan of Quidditch. If you hurry, I expect you may still see the end of the tryouts." James barely heard him. He turned on his heels and bolted along the corridor, cursing his forgetfulness. If he'd not been so obsessed with worrying about the stupid defense club, he'd have known that the first meeting conflicted with Quidditch tryouts. Neither Rose nor Ralph was trying out for the teams, so they wouldn't even have considered the conflict. James had been practicing all summer for the opportunity to be on the Gryffindor house team. He desperately wanted to make up for his devastating performance at last year's tryouts. Also, Albus was out there even now, trying out for the Slytherin team on Tabitha Corsica's cursed broomstick. James felt an obsessive impulse to be there when that happened, but he truthfully didn't know if it was because he wanted to protect Albus or sabotage him. James pounded up the steps, calling out the password to the common room. The fat lady scolded him for broadcasting the password to the entire hall, but James barely heard her, shimmying through the portrait hole the moment the painting began to swing open. James grabbed his broom from beneath his bed, took the stairs two at a time down to the common room, and felt another stab of panic as he crossed the empty room. Everyone was already down at the pitch, cheering, watching the tryouts, supporting the team. James was supposed to be there. The fat lady was still scolding James as he pushed through the portrait hole and flung himself down the stairs. How could he have forgotten? If he thought it was possible, he'd almost believe that Tabitha Corsica had somehow arranged for him to be absent, simply so he couldn't interfere with Albus' tryout. At the same time, a distant part of him worried that he was missing the first defense club meeting. Rose would probably realize where he'd gone as soon as she noticed his absence, but still, it would be a disappointment and a setback. Had Merlin appeared at that exact moment just to sabotage the first defense club meeting? After all, the headmaster certainly had uncanny ways of knowing what was happening around the school. Merlin would know how important Quidditch was to James. Was it possible that he had bewitched James to forget the tryouts, just so he could strategically remind him at the last minute, thus keeping him from the club meeting? Frustrated and annoyed, James burst out of the castle's main entrance and darted across the courtyard. As he turned toward the Quidditch pitch, he heard the maddening sound of cheers and whistles. It was nearly dark, but James could make out the shapes of the Quidditch players circling over the pitch, their cloaks snapping gaily in the wind. It was too late, but James couldn't bring himself to turn back. He cursed his luck again. How could he have forgotten Quidditch tryouts? He wouldn't have believed it was possible. What would he tell his mum and dad? How would he live it down with his housemates? Certainly, Scorpius Malfoy would make the most of it. "I see, Potter," he'd say, "you forgot the tryouts, did you? Strange. And we were also looking forward to being amazed and impressed by your performance. Perhaps you'll remember next year." The crowd was departing even as James arrived at the pitch. He found himself wading upstream through the throng, not really knowing what he was looking for but refusing to give up. He considered getting onto his broom and simply flying out over the pitch, but he was reluctant to draw too much attention to himself. He finally shouldered onto the grass of the pitch and spied the Gryffindor Quidditch captain, Devendar Doss, collecting the house brooms. "Dev," James called, panting. "Tell me it isn't too late." Devendar stopped and looked back. "Where were you, James?" "It's all over. I was looking forward to seeing what you could do this year. I completely forgot." Somehow, James admitted desperately. "Let me go anyway. I'm ready." Devendar shook his head. "I can't, James. All the positions are filled already. Honestly, we had a pretty strong lineup going in. We'll need you more next year, once Hugo and Terry graduate." James was speechless. He stood on the spot, breathing hard from his sprint out to the pitch. He glared helplessly around at the departing students and players. Louis Weasley was approaching from the Hufflepuff grandstand. "What happened to you, James?" Louis called. "Albus was looking for you after the Slytherin tryouts." James ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I don't even want to talk about it. How did Albus do?" "So, he was totally brilliant," Louis replied enthusiastically. "Victoire says he was the best first-year tryout she's ever seen. I bet he was the best since your dad, even. He's going to be Slytherin Seeker. It's perfect, in a way, don't you think? I mean, your dad was Seeker for Gryffindor, his first." Yeah, I get it, Louis," James interrupted sourly. "Is he gone already?" "Yeah, the whole team headed back together. Albus said to tell you to come down with Ralph if you can. He's pretty excited about it. He was going to write your mum and dad first thing. They'll be totally proud, I bet." "Yeah," James muttered, dragging his broom and heading back off the pitch. "That's great. See you around, Louis." "I'm really sorry, James," Rose said as they climbed the stairs to the common room. "It never even occurred to me to check. And Ralph's really not much of a Quidditch fan, so he wouldn't have even noticed. I figured it out right away and assumed you'd rushed out to the pitch. So, No luck, then? It was a complete bust, James grumbled. I missed the whole thing. On top of it all, Slytherin's tryouts were tonight, too, and it sounds like a flu rings around everybody. He's going to be Slytherin's seeker. Oh, Rose replied brightly. Well, that's really cool, isn't it? He'll look very dashing in his green cloak and pads. I bet your mum and dad will be very pleased. I really wish people would stop saying that, James said darkly. I don't blame you for being angry that you missed the tryouts, James, but being jealous of Albus. I'm not jealous, Rose. James exclaimed. The whole thing is a trick. It has to be. The Slytherins are just setting him up. And why would they do that? Rose asked, simply. If they were as black-hearted as you say, wouldn't they be trying to bury him rather than prop him up? They don't work that way anymore. They're all sneaky and two-faced now. Tabitha's Fong and Talon's Club is just this year's version of the progressive element. They were the ones who set up the debate where she said that my dad was a liar and a fraud. They actually believe that Voldemort was a great fellow and that people like our parents have lied about him all these years. Nobody really believes that silliness, Rose replied. It's just popular to rock the boat. Either way, Albus can handle himself. He's not a dummy. James glowered. He doesn't know Tabitha like I do. Well, Rose said, deliberately changing the subject, Defense Club went well. We had 26 people, which is really good considering Quidditch tryouts were tonight. Mostly, we just talked about club goals and established the rules. I'll fill you in on that later. Then we ran through some fundamental disarming spells, just so everybody was starting on the same page. Who led the class? You? James asked as they approached the portrait of the fat lady. I can't imagine Ralph let you talk him into showing anyone how to perform Expelliarmus spells. He doesn't much trust his own wand with that kind of thing even though he's better than he used to be. No, Rose answered slowly. Ralph didn't do it. And neither did I. It went very well though. Rose said the password and the portrait swung open. The fat lady glared at James, remembering his conduct earlier in the evening. The sound of raucous laughter and music poured through the portrait hole. Then who did you get? James asked, suddenly suspicious. He followed Rose into the crowded room. Scorpius Malfoy lounged on the couch near the fireplace. He glanced up and smiled crookedly as James and Rose entered. Good of you to show up, Potter, he drawled. I understand you found a way to overlook 2 appointments at the same time, tonight. Not that we missed you, exactly. Hush, Scorpius, Rose said, sitting down on the other end of the couch. We really should discuss plans for the next club meeting. I'd appreciate it if you two could find a way to be civil to each other. You really did ask him to teach the class? James said, pointing at Malfoy. You've got to be kidding. Malfoy produced his glasses from a pocket and put them on. This really isn't your night, is it, Potter? Cheer up. You should consider yourself lucky that I'm not interested in being on the Quidditch team, otherwise, I wouldn't have been available. Look, both of you, Rose interjected before James could reply, we have more important matters to discuss than how much you two annoy each other. If you haven't noticed, this defense club serves a more important purpose than just giving us something to do one night a week. How much did you tell him? James demanded. If you haven't noticed, his family is all Death Eaters. You might want to think twice about trusting him. Technically, my father was never actually inducted. I thought you knew that, Scorpius said, meeting James' eye. But if you mean did she tell me about her suspicions about the headmaster, no, she didn't. I was already well aware of them. As hard as this may be for you to believe, I'm on the same side as you, Potter. Hot. James spat. That's where you're wrong. I don't agree with either of you about Merlin. Even if there is some evil plot in the works, I'd suspect your family was involved before I'd go pointing fingers at Merlin. He saved his school last year. We've discussed all of this, James, Rose said, motioning for James to keep his voice down. Scorpius doesn't approve of some of the things his family has done in the past. That's part of the reason he's here in Gryffindor. And you know what we saw in the mirror. There's no question that we have to be careful around the headmaster. As of right now, the evidence is that he's in league with. The evidence is that you've been suspicious of him from the beginning, James exclaimed. But you're wrong. You're both wrong, and I'm going to prove it. Scorpius narrowed his eyes at James. Well, I do hope you pulled it off. I suspect a lot of us would take some comfort in that proof. Until then, however. Scorpius pointed his wand lazily at the chair next to the couch. Perhaps it would be a good idea to do as Rose says. We have a defense club to prepare. And she seems very stubborn about you and Ralph Deedle being a part of it. Still, if sitting in the same room with a Malfoy is too much for you, it's fine by me if you go elsewhere. There's a bed upstairs with your name on it. James ground his teeth. Nothing had gone right this entire evening. And now he couldn't see any choice but to sit down and plan what Scorpius Malfoy was going to teach them at the next defense club meeting. It was singularly humiliating. He almost couldn't bring himself to do it. He still had his broom with him, reminding him of his second failure to make the Quidditch team. All he wanted to do was go back upstairs, stuff it back under his bed, and try to forget the whole mess. But Rose was looking at him pleadingly, obviously hoping that James would be able to overcome his innate dislike of the pale boy long enough to give the defense club a chance to work. Sighing resignedly, James propped his broom by the fireplace and threw himself onto the chair. Fine, he said. What do we need to do next? Rose clapped her hands excitedly. Thank you, James. I knew I could trust you. Scorpius really is a pretty good teacher, but it's hard for some of the Gryffindors to listen to him. There's still a lot of long-term prejudice against a Malfoy in Gryffindor, and having him teach the class just makes matters worse. Still, if you're there, it should really help give Scorpius the credibility he needs. Hey, you guys, expecting somebody? Grimm said as he entered the room. Only, I found this bloke hanging around outside the portrait pole. He says you invited him, Rose. Ralph grinned sheepishly as Rose jumped up. Sorry, Ralph. I haven't gotten around to telling James about Scorpius, and then. Well, anyway, we're all here, so let's get started. Scorpius looked annoyed as Ralph crammed onto the couch between him and Rose. The big boy kicked his shoes off and propped his feet on the overstuffed footstool. Good club tonight. Scorpius here may be a skinny bloke, but he knows a few tricks. Some of you Gryffindors may have a bit of an attitude problem about him, but I need all the help I can get, Ralph said breezily. So, and James? James glanced up at Ralph, arching an eyebrow. Ralph smiled sheepishly. Albus says to tell you you'll be better as Truth than he'll be as Slytherin Seeker. He was hoping he'd see you tonight. Even Tabitha asked if you were going to come down. James didn't know what to say. After a moment, Scorpius broke the tension. This is all very touching, he said dryly, but I recognize Slytherin smooth-talking when I hear it. I'm a bit of an expert on the subject, as James has already pointed out. Can we discuss Defense Club now? The four of them talked for the next hour. James grew grudgingly confident that Scorpius may indeed be able to teach them some decent defensive spells. It turned out that he had, in fact, been tutored from an early age by his grandfather, Lucius Malfoy, who was currently in seclusion and not speaking to the family. Scorpius admitted that he hadn't seen his grandfather for a few years, ever since he and Scorpius' dad had had a rather serious row. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the 4 students were beginning to pack up for the night when Deirdre Finnegan, one of Cameron Creevy's first-year friends, barreled into the common room, panting and red-faced. She glanced wildly around the room, and then pressed through the crowd, heading directly for rear corner. "Once with her?" Scorpius muttered. Rose said, "She's heading for Petra's table." The entire room hushed as the significance of Deirdre's announcement became known. "It's true," she was saying. "I saw them leading her to the hospital wing." She could barely stand up. Petra simply looked at Deirdre, her mouth slightly open. "Who?" Hugo called from across the room. "What happened?" "Josephina Bartlett." Deirdre cried breathlessly, turning to face the room. She ate a cursed peppermint, and it struck her with a terrible fear of heights. They found her hugging the floor of the balcony outside the Ravenclaw common room. She couldn't even stand up. Her friends said the peppermint had come in a box of chocolates from a secret admirer, but it was obviously from some enemy instead. "Madame Curio says she'll be a little better by morning, but the effects won't completely wear off for months." "A fear of heights peppermint," Grimm said, screwing up his face. "Does Weasley's make those?" "I don't think so," Sabrina said. "That sounds like a custom curse." Damien narrowed his eyes. "One guess who Josephina's secret admirer is?" "I heard all about how she and Corsica went at it during the audition." "You're all missing the point," Deirdre said, nearly bouncing. "Josephina's been cursed with a fear of heights. She'll hardly be able to climb a curb for months." Sabrina's eyes widened. "She can't climb onto the stage in the amphitheater. If she can't get onto the stage, she can't play the part of Astra," Damien finished, grinning. "As much as I hate to see anyone benefit from another's misfortune, let me be the first to congratulate our good friend Petra. The new and improved Astrid the Beauboys." Petra looked around, an expression of surprise and disbelief on her face. "Well, I wouldn't have wanted to get the role this way," she said. "But I suppose I wouldn't turn it down either." Sabrina whooped happily. A cheer arose from the gathered students, and James saw Petra smile for the first time in weeks. Suddenly, he remembered that he was playing the part of True's, Astra's younger love interest. His face reddened considerably as he looked across the room at Petra. He noticed Rose was smiling knowingly at him. "What?" he said, patting his cheeks. "I'm hot. I'm sitting right next to the fireplace." Rose grinned, nodding. "So, this is going to be so much fun, cousin. I expect you'd better start practicing up. Petra is going to have pretty high expectations for the kiss of true and everlasting love. Over the next week, autumn finally descended in full, putting a brisk chill into the air and painting the trees with vibrant oranges, reds, and yellows. Hagrid took his Care of Magical Creatures class into their winter classroom, a huge, ancient barn with stone walls and thick, cobwebbed rafters. There, he'd assembled an impressive array of fantastic creatures, all arranged in order of size. Along the entrance wall was a range of cages and pens, out of which emanated the sounds of amiable snufflings, grunts, squeals, and barks. On the other side of the dirt floor was a line of stables, each one larger than the last. The nearest one sheltered a hippogriff whose name, according to the sign painted on the gate, was Flintflank. The creature snapped its beak at the nearby cages, apparently hungry for their contents. The larger stables had thick doors, preventing any peek at their occupants. The last 2 doors were plated with iron and barred with huge crossbeams. They were easily 20 feet tall. Occasionally, an unsettlingly resonant growl or burst of roar would shake the barn. James shrugged out of his cloak as he walked through the great front door, surprised at the warmth of the space despite the day's crisp chill. "How's he heat a place like this?" Ralph asked, craning his head up at the high, wooden ceiling. "It's right balmy in here." The students filed into the barn, peering curiously into the cages or tentatively approaching the hippogriff stable. The great beast stamped its foreleg and tossed its beaked head. "Stay well back now," Hagrid called. "We'll meet old Flintflank a bit later in the year. Until then, it's best if he sees you from across the room instead of right in front of him. Let's start the season off by getting to know some of the smaller beasts here in the cages and such." Hagrid led the class over to the smaller cages lining the wall. He fiddled with one of the locks as he spoke. "We've been right lucky over the years to come across so many examples of the magical world's most unusual creatures. A former student of mine has become something of an expert on beast tracking, and she brings me any creatures she finds that have been injured or fallen sick. I do my best to nurse 'em back to health, but a few of 'em never gets to the point of being able to survive in the wild again. I give 'em the best home I can, of course. The end result is that we've become rather well known around the magical world for our menagerie." Hagrid turned, cradling a small lump of breathing brown fur in his arm. "Why, experts come from the world over to meet and study our little family. Isn't that right, Pumpkin?" Ralph leaned toward James and whispered, "I talked to Rose this morning. She thinks she's found out something important about Merlin." James whispered back, "Whatever it is, I don't want to hear it. She's always digging up new dirt from some old legend or crusty history book. We know most of that stuff's not true." "I don't know it's not true," Ralph murmured. "I just know he doesn't quite seem like that anymore. Either way, she says you'll want to hear it. It explains a little bit of where all the stories came from about how he didn't love the Muggle world. She says it puts it all in context, whatever that means." James pressed his lips together doubtfully. He'd told Rose and Scorpius that he intended to prove Merlin wasn't involved in the conspiracy they'd witnessed in the mirror, but he hadn't yet done it. In fact, the idea of doing so frightened him quite a lot. It wasn't that he didn't have a plan. He did, and it was quite simple. It would require some bravery and the help of Cedric's ghost, and it could get him into quite a lot of trouble if he was caught, but none of those things were what worried him. He felt estranged, pressing reluctance to go ahead with it, mostly because he was secretly afraid of what he might discover. If he was right, then Merlin wasn't involved, and James could prove it to Rose and everyone else. But what if he was wrong? Despite his words to the contrary, James was worried about it. What if he went through with his plan and found that the headmaster was, in fact, in league with the former Death Eaters and that horrible, smoky entity? Worse, what if the entity was the thing the cave skeleton, Farragon, had talked about, the Gatekeeper, which Merlin was supposedly responsible for bringing into the world? The headmaster had been acting rather secretive and suspicious. He'd forbidden James from telling anyone what the skeleton of Farragon had said, and that was worrisome in itself. If what the skeleton had said wasn't true, why would Merlin care if James told anyone? James shook his head. Surely, Merlin had his reasons. Merlin had to be good. He'd come back to help when the school had been threatened by the Muggle reporter, hadn't he? And all because James had asked him. And that, James realized with a sinking coldness, was why he couldn't face the idea that Merlin might not be who he claimed he was. Because James was responsible, twice over, for bringing the Great Wizard here, first, by being manipulated by Madame Delacroix into facilitating Merlin's return to the present day, and second, by sending a message of help to Merlin via the tree sprites, with whom Merlin was able to commune. It had even been James' advice that led his father and uncle to campaign for Merlin to become the new school headmaster. If Merlin was involved in something evil, then it was on James' head. He would be ultimately responsible for whatever happened. Recognizing that, James knew that he had to find out what Merlin's intentions really were, no matter what. And if, by some horrible chance, Merlin was in league with evil, then it was up to James to foil him, no matter what it took. Now then, Hagrid was saying, beaming out over the students, Who wants to come up and give me a hand feeding Lil Pumpkin the Tripthroat? Trenton Block raised his hand, and Hagrid beckoned him forward. Here, yep, go, Mr. Block. Just dangle this wee bit of lempweed in the air, but not too close. Hold it up and let me bring Pumpkin toward ya. Trenton seemed annoyed at the caution Hagrid was taking with the little ball of panting fur. It looked rather like a kitten, but with no apparent head, tail, or limbs. What's it going to do, Hagrid? Trenton asked, holding up the rubbery bit of plant. Purr me to death. Trenton's last word turned into a little shriek of surprise as something huge and furry lunged up from the ball in Hagrid's arms. It reared a slobbering, toothless mouth and clamped down on Trenton's entire hand. With a loud slurping sound, it sucked the bit of lempweed out of Trenton's hand and retreated, disappearing into the tiny, panting ball of fur in Hagrid's arms. Trenton yanked his hand back, shaking it and shuddering visibly. Nicely done, Mr. Block, Hagrid cried, laughing. Pumpkin likes, yeah. Or else she thinks you're a frog with a bit more lempweed on your backside. Normally, tripthroats live in the marsh where they suck the weed off the little amphibious creatures and then spit 'em back out. None too pleasant for the frogs, but totally harmless. Trenton stared at his hand, which was coated with a viscous cream goo. He looked helplessly at Hagrid. Yeah, might want to go wash that off, Mr. Block. Frog skin is immune to the tripthroat's digestive juices, but ya might get a bit itchy if ya leave it there. There's a pump and basin over by the big stables. That's a lad. Hagrid placed Pumpkin back in her cage and locked it. He was just explaining the lifespan of the tripthroat when a very large roar rumbled the building's foundation. James looked toward the sound of the roar, his eyes wide and his heart suddenly pounding. Trenton was quickly backing away from the huge, iron-framed door, his hands still dripping water from the basin. So, she caught your scent, Mr. Block. Silly me, I forgot, she loves a good tripthroat snack. Stand aside now, that's right. She's about to blow. Suddenly, an enormous noise filled the barn. To James, it sounded something like a freight train mixed with a cyclone. The barn heated appreciably, and the center of the iron door began to glow a dull red. My apologies, Mr. Block, Hagrid said. Old Norberta doesn't get many tripthroats these days, but she can smell when they're nearby. I should have warned, yeah. So that's how he keeps the barn heated, Ralph said nervously, his eyes wide. He keeps a dragon. A real, live dragon. That's not just any dragon, James said, grinning. That's like an old family friend. Uncle Charlie's been keeping tabs on her for years. She wounded a wing a few years back, and now she can't fly. Not being able to fly is a death sentence in the dragon world. They eat their own, you know. She's really just a great soft egg, Hagrid said affectionately. I've known ER since she was a hatchling. Still, it doesn't do to stand too near her doors when she's in a flaming mood. We'll take her out this winter, give her a little exercise. She likes a good romp in the snow, does the old dear. Excellent. Ashley Doone said from behind James. Maybe Trenton will volunteer to feed her as well. Slytherins and dragons are supposed to have quite the rapport. No chance, Trenton said as he rejoined the students, his face flushed and angry. I wonder if my parents know that this great oaf is keeping a dragon on school grounds. He's been a maniac for years, but this is completely daft. Shut up, Trenton, James said amiably. Norberta's safe. Safer than you with a tripthroat, at least. We'll see about that, Trenton muttered darkly. James spent most of Muggle studies in the rather uncomfortable process of being measured for his True's costume. Jennifer Tellis, in charge of the costume shop, performed the duties herself, a quill behind her ear and a couple of pins clenched between her lips. Stand still, she said around the pins. You're not letting me get a good inseam measurement. You want your pantaloons to be sagging. It tickles. James replied, and then asked suspiciously, "What are pantaloons?" "Don't ask me to explain them. It's best if you don't think about it. Just know that you're getting off easy compared to what Petra has to wear." James wanted to ask, but decided not to. He hadn't spoken to Petra since Josephina's peppermint incident. He was a little giddy and excited about the idea of playing truce to Petra's Astra, but he was trying very hard not to let on. Jennifer pulled her measuring tape around James' waist. "Have you read the whole script yet?" she asked. "No," James admitted. "I know the story a little though. Boy falls for girl. Older bloke falls for the same girl. Older bloke sends boy off on a suicide mission to get rid of him. Boy comes back and they duel. Everybody lives happily ever after. The end." Jennifer glanced at James sardonically. "I think you'd better read the script," she said around her pins. "I will," James said, annoyed. "I have to know my lines, don't I?" "Yes, but you should also know that they don't live happily ever after. The triumvirate is a tragedy, you dolt." James looked at himself in the nearby mirror. "So what's that mean?" "Well," Jennifer mumbled, "generally, it means everybody ends up dead." As James left Muggle Studies, Rose caught up to him. "Did Ralph tell you what I found out last night?" she asked in a low voice. "He said you found out why some people thought Merlin would hate Muggles," James replied, "but he didn't give me any details." "You'll be interested in this," Rose said earnestly. "Did you ever hear of the Lady of the Lake?" James thought for a moment. It sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. He shrugged and shook his head. "Well, according to all the legends, she was supposed to have been Merlin's downfall. Most of the stories portray her as an imp or a dryad or a sprite, but they're mostly really fanciful and probably just exaggerations of the truth. Professor Revalvier talked about it last Wislit, remember? She said that if the legends had been true, Merlin obviously wouldn't be here as headmaster." "Yeah," James said, recalling the class. "She said that the stories make the Lady of the Lake out to be a sort of magical creature pretending to be all innocent and stuff. She gets Merlin to fall for her, and then, when he teaches her everything he knows, she traps him with his own magic. Obviously, it's just stories. Probably, it was all just a way to explain Merlin's disappearance. We know the truth though, like Revalvier said." "We know a bit more of the truth now," Rose said enigmatically. "The Lady of the Lake wasn't made up, but she wasn't what the legends make her out to be. She was a Muggle, and she was almost Merlin's wife." "What?" James said, stopping in the hall. "Where'd you get that?" "The Book of Austramaticus's Histories," Rose said, raising her eyebrows. "Same book where Zane found the account of Merlin's disapparition last year. Morgan Petonia let me borrow it from the Ravenclaw library. Austramaticus knew Merlin better than almost anyone, although it seems to me that Merlin didn't like him very much. Merlin sure didn't waste any time on him when he reapparated," James said, nodding. "It was Austramaticus's ghost who was supposed to watch for the time to be right for Merlin's return. He was bound to the job forever. I got the impression that Merlin thought Austramaticus had hurried his return just to finish his duties. It didn't go very well for him after that." "What did Merlin do?" Rose asked eagerly. "How do you punish a ghost?" James shook his head. "It's me, but Austramaticus was terrified of whatever it was. He screamed like a banshee, but Merlin just sort of popped him. Very creepy," Rose said, thinking. "Yet, whatever. It's old news now. What's the story with the Lady of the Lake?" "Well, according to Austramaticus, she was a Muggle peasant named Judith. She lived on a tiny farm with a little spring lake on it. That's where her name came from. The farm had been managed by Judith and her mother until her mother died. The lord of the fiefdom was a guy named Hayden. He planned to banish Judith from the farm because she couldn't manage it on her own, but Merlin protected her. He sent away the brutes who'd come to throw her out. Apparently, he gave them donkey ears and told them if they came back he'd finish the job. See? James said. That doesn't sound like the actions of a wizard who hates muggles. He was helping her, wasn't he? Yes, but only because he loved her. The book says that Judith was really beautiful, and Merlin was completely smitten by her. Austen actually said that Merlin was under her spell. Pretty strong words for a wizard to use when describing a muggle woman. So what happened? James asked. We know they didn't end up together for some reason. Maybe she double-crossed him. That could be where the legends get the story about her trapping him somehow. Rose shook her head, her eyes sparkling. No. Austen thinks she loved him too. It was enough to get Merlin to cease his dealings with the Muggle kingdoms. He stopped hiring himself out as a magical mercenary and abandoned his throne as the mediator between the Muggle and magical realms. Loads of people were mad about it, and lots of others were eager to step into Merlin's place. Meanwhile, Merlin safeguarded the farm that Judith lived on. He made really thick briars and thorns grow up all around the perimeter, keeping out Hayden's brutes. Merlin even paid for the property, 10 times what the farm was worth. And then, just to be safe, he started teaching Judith some magic. You can't just teach a muggle magic, Rose, James interrupted. You're either born with it or not. Rose shook her head. Merlin's magic is different, isn't it? He gets it as much from nature as he does from his wizarding heritage. He couldn't teach her how to find the magic inside her because there wasn't any there. Judith had no witch in her blood. But he could teach her how to use the magic in nature. A little, at least. She just needed to know enough to be able to protect herself, so Merlin taught her how to alter her appearance. That way, she could go to the markets unnoticed. She had to, because Hayden had put a price on her capture. Things seemed to be working just fine for them, and it looked like Merlin was going to marry her. But then, well, it gets really awful. What? James insisted, enthralled by the story. Well, they caught her, of course, Rose said breathlessly. She got careless. The magical disguise was perfect. Nobody knew who she was at the markets in the fiefdom. But someone saw her use a little of Merlin's magic. She fixed a broken wheel on a boy's cart, just by holding the pieces together and saying an incantation Merlin had taught her. The wood knitted back together, fixing the wheel, but someone saw it happen. They told the fiefdom brutes, who were always hanging around the market. They captured Judith and took her to Hayden in his castle. I bet Merlin wanted to kill them all, James said meaningfully. I mean, she was just trying to help. What did he do? He didn't know where she was at first, but he tracked her down. He's apparently very good at that, being able to talk to the birds and creatures and trees. Hayden knew Merlin would show up. He told the guards to let Merlin through, right into the Lord's Hall. Merlin didn't even waste time on the guards, though. He just put them all to sleep and stalked right up to Hayden, demanding the release of Judith. Hayden was all oily and slick. He told Merlin he had every intention of giving her back, but only if Merlin agreed to return. The farm, remove the thorn hedge, and as a tribute of respect, double the fiefdom's lands. James furrowed his brow. Double the lands. Everything was about land back then. The bigger a lord's fiefdom, the wealthier he was. Hayden's plan was to use Merlin to steal land from neighboring fiefs. He also made Merlin promise to leave the fief forever and bestow his protection over the castle, which included protection from Merlin himself. Hayden was really crafty and evil. He knew that as soon as Merlin had Judith back, he'd probably destroy the castle and everyone in it. But with Merlin's spell of protection, Not only could the castle never be overtaken, Merlin himself couldn't touch a single brick or harm a single hair of anyone inside it. He didn't do it, did he? James asked. Rose nodded. He did. He was that madly in love with Judith. He left and went out into the neighboring fiefdoms. There is no record of how he did it, but when he came back, he presented Hayden with the deeds of enough new land to double his fief. I shudder to think how Merlin got all that land, but it had to have been scary. Lords didn't let go of land without a fight. James frowned thoughtfully. So did Hayden release Judith. Well, that's where the story breaks down, Rose said uncomfortably. Austen writes as if his readers already know the rest of the story. I'd guess that whatever happened, it was legend in that part of the world for a long time. Unfortunately, the legend got lost in all the myths and exaggerations in the centuries since. Either way, it looks like it ended badly. I mean, like Professor Revalvier said, Merlin's here with us now, but not the Lady of the Lake. The important thing is, this could explain why people always believed Merlin might have a grudge against the Muggle world. He was trapped by that Muggle lord, Hayden, humiliated by him, and wasn't even able to have his revenge. To a wizard like Merlin, that's got to be enough to brew up a case of serious hate. Yet, you couldn't blame him for being really angry, James agreed, but that doesn't mean he'd hate the whole Muggle world. Just because there was one evil Muggle prat, that's hardly reason to go to war against the lot of them. Well, that's what some people believed, Rose said, shrugging. But Merlin himself never actually said so. Officially speaking, he never said anything again. He was never again seen in public, and it's right after that that Austen talks about Merlinus leaving the Society of Men until the time was right for him. It's no wonder people have been suspicious all these centuries. And still are today, James said pointedly. That doesn't mean I agree with everything people have said about him, Rose replied quietly. But it certainly makes one understand how Merlin might have developed a bit of a serious grudge. Love makes people do mad things. James sighed. I've got a plan, Rose, he admitted in a low voice. I wasn't sure I was going to go through with it, but I am now. I need to clear Merlin's name if I can. I'm going to find out the truth about whether he is involved with those people we sought, and that horrible, thing in the smoky cloak. Rose narrowed her eyes at James. You know something about that thing, don't you? She asked. You're hiding something. Does it have to do with that weird pain you get in your forehead sometimes? What? James said, startled. No. I don't feel that anymore. Right, Rose nodded. You smacked your forehead and yelled in pain that day outside the headmaster's office because you suddenly remembered the extra credit answer on your arithmancy test. James deflated. Look, yeah, I still feel it sometimes. I don't know where it's coming from. But it doesn't have anything to do with Merlin, all right? Scorpius says you're having bad dreams, Rose said, looking closely at James. Bloody hell, Rose. What's he doing, staying up nights taking notes? He says you've been talking in your sleep and getting all worked up. He can't hear what you're saying, but it always seems to be the same. And it's happening a couple of times a week. James glared at Rose, and then looked away. Yeah, so what? I hardly ever even remember the dreams. And even when I do, they don't make any sense. There's always a voice talking, and flashing blades, and the sound of old machinery. Someone is walking and I'm following them, but I can't see who it is. And then there's water and some weird faces. So what? It's just a dream. It doesn't mean anything. Rose rolled her eyes. I know you well enough to know you don't believe that. James shook his head. Look, I don't know what it's all about. Maybe it does have something to do with the weird pain I get on my forehead sometimes. Cedric. Cedric says he can actually see a scar there. He says it glows green. No. Rose exclaimed, as if she thought that was the coolest thing she'd ever heard. She leaned in, studying James' forehead. Can you see it when you look in the mirror? Does it glow when you turn off the lights? This isn't funny, Rose. James said, backing away. But at least it means I'm not a nutter. If Cedric sees it, then it isn't in my head. Yeah, Rose agreed. Technically, it's on your head. James grimaced at his cousin. But the point is that this has nothing to do with how I intend to find out the truth about Merlin. How, James? Rose asked, seriously. I mean, Ralph's right about one thing. If Merlin is involved with that evil plot, he's one scary character to go up against. He'd have no qualms about getting you out of the way. Let Ralph and me help you, at least. James shook his head. I don't need help, Rose. Sorry. It'd just get you two into trouble too if we got caught. Rose had always been very practical. She nodded solemnly. When are you going to do it? James' face grew determined. Tonight, if I can. If everything goes right, we'll know the truth by tomorrow morning. Wish me luck. You'll need more than luck, you Burke, Rose said. I certainly hope you know what you're doing. James thought of the way Merlin had found him in the halls, both when he'd been standing guard for the gremlins and when he'd gone for the rolling chalkboard. Merlin knew when things were going on around the school, and he'd know what James was up to if James wasn't very careful. So do I, Rose, James agreed as he and his cousin walked down the corridor toward the Great Hall. So do I. James had a simple plan. He'd talked Cedric's ghost into helping, although it had been a close thing. Cedric didn't like going into the headmaster's office now that Merlin was occupying it, and there was some sort of boundary that prevented ghosts from entering the headmaster's personal quarters. Still, Cedric could hover outside the windows and see when the lights went off. Presumably, Merlin slept sometime. When the lights in his quarters had been off for an hour, Cedric was to come and wake James. James went to bed that night certain that he wouldn't sleep a wink. He was nervous about his plan, partly because he thought he might be caught no matter how sneaky he was and partly because he was afraid of what he'd discover if the plan succeeded. Every time he began to drift to sleep, he'd imagine he was hearing Cedric coming to wake him. It was silly because the ghost made no noise whatsoever unless he wanted to, so James would never hear his approach. Still, every bump and creak caught James' attention until, eventually, he drifted into a fitful sleep. He had the dream again, but it was different this time. As always, it began with the swish and glimmer of metal blades, frighteningly close, and the rumble of ancient machinery. There was the voice, silky and ingratiating, a little maddening. It echoed so that James couldn't understand it, but occasional phrases slipped through. Time is not yet come, the voice said, and the task set before you and bearer of redemption. In the dream, James shuddered. There was a figure walking with him, but all James could see in the darkness was a faceless silhouette. James seemed to float with the figure, as if carried by it somehow. He felt the scar on his head like a weight. Then, for the first time, light bloomed in the strange space. It emanated from the pool, green and flickering, throwing dancing ripples over every surface. The walls were stone, old and slick with moss. James had a sense of being underground, far from the light of day. The voice continued to speak as figures moved in the brightly glimmering water, like reflections from another world. The voice came from a figure in the dark corner, draped in black. As it spoke, the two faces formed in the water again, their expressions both sad and hopeful, pleading. They were clearer this time, rippling just under the water's surface, a man and a woman, younger than James' parents. James' companion gasped and dropped to kneel, crawling to the water's edge, reaching to touch the rippling surface. Stop, the voice commanded. The time is not yet come. You would join them in that world, not return them to this one. Their blood calls for payment. Only then can they cross over. But you can extract that payment. You are the one to bring about redemption, not only for them, but for all who've gone over at the will of the oppressors. You are the hand of balance. Your duty is harsh, and your burden heavy, but it is not without its rewards. You will have them back. And you will live to see the day of change. If you wish it. I wish it, the voice of James' companion whispered, and James whispered it as well, helpless not to. His voice made no sound at all. He awoke, startled by some noise. The dream remained vivid in his memory so that it almost felt like he was still dreaming. He sat up in his bed and could tell by the moonlight that it was the very dead of night. Nearby, Graham slept with one arm dangling over the bed. The room was full of the silence of deep sleep. "Cedric?" James whispered very quietly, careful not to wake anyone. He threw back his covers and slipped out of bed. There was no sign of the ghost. Perhaps he was down in the common room. James collected his wand and his glasses from his satchel and made his way to the stairs. He stopped near the doorway, noticing something strange. Scorpius' bed was rumpled but empty. James narrowed his eyes. Where was that little viper? He thought about Scorpius telling Rose he'd heard James talking in his sleep. Why had Scorpius been awake those times? He was surely up to something. Reluctantly, James determined to think about it later. He had more important things to do now. He turned and crept down the stairs to the common room. The room was completely empty and dark, except for the dull red glow of the fireplace. There was still no sign of Cedric's ghost. James whispered his name again, a little louder this time, but there was no response. James sighed and walked over to the fireplace. As he plopped into the high-back chair, a voice spoke up brightly, shocking him. "Hey, James," the voice said. "Where's everybody at?" James spluttered, looking around. "What? Who?" Zane. Zane stood by the fireplace, apparently leaning on the mantel, although he didn't quite seem to be touching it. He grinned mischievously. "Who else?" "You got my duck, I see." James began, still recovering from the shock. "No." "What?" "Your duck." "What are you doing here?" "I sent you a message by duck a few minutes ago," Zane said, referring to the protean rubber ducks they used to send notes to each other. James had completely forgotten about his. "I assumed you got the message. I told you and Ralph to meet me by the fireplace in 5 minutes. So where's everybody else? This place is dead as a doorknob." James rolled his eyes. "So that's what woke me up." "Zane, it's the middle of the night," he exclaimed, stifling a grin. Zane's utter precociousness always amazed him. "Ralph's in bed, down in the Slytherin quarters." "You forgot the time difference again." "So, yeah," Zane said, grimacing. "It's only 8 here. I mean, there. Where I really am. So what do you think of this? Much better than the lunar fly dust. Do I look all right?" James squinted. "Well, you did a minute ago. You're starting to fade a bit around the edges. How are you doing it?" "It's pretty good, eh?" Zane replied. Another of Professor Franklin's brainstorms. The beauty of it is its simplicity. You ever hear of a doppelganger? James frowned. Yeah, actually. It's a mythical double of yourself. It shows up to warn you of your own impending death, right? Zane nodded brightly. Yeah, exactly. Franklin figured if we faked the circumstances of untimely death, the doppelganger might show up. Then, when it did, we could harness it and send it out to relay personal messages, like this one. So you're in mortal peril over there? James asked, furrowing his brow. Yes and no. The doppelganger has to think so, but Professor Franklin has it all worked out. There are loads of fail-safes. I'm only technically in mortal peril. When we finish talking, I'll be in the clear again. It's all a little complicated, but the department has worked out most of the bugs. You have your wand with you? Yeah, James answered. Shoot me with it, will you? It doesn't matter how. A stinging hex or something. I'm starting to fade out. What? I mean, are you sure? Totally. Make it quick. See, the problem with this method of communicating is maintaining the magic over long distances. We need a boost from your end to keep it up, otherwise, I'll just fade out. James produced his wand and, reluctantly, pointed it at the fading figure of Zane. Asarvespa, he pronounced. A thin, needle-like bolt shot out of his wand. Zane's figure seemed to absorb the bolt. It grew suddenly solid again. That hit the spot, Zane said. So how are things across the pond? James said, slouching in his chair. Complicated. Albus is a Slytherin. I'm getting phantom broadcasts through some kind of ghost scar. The son of Dad's mortal enemy stole my bed, and everybody is worried Merlin has gone evil. Zane grimaced. Whoa. That's a mouthful. One thing at a time. You don't think the big guy's gone evil, do you? James shook his head tiredly. No, but some people do. Even Rose does. Especially after the other night. James told Zane about the scene in the Amsara Surth mirror. Zane listened critically, one corner of his mouth cinched up in his unique expression of thoughtfulness. So what happened then? Zane asked once James had finished. What do you mean? That's it. Isn't that enough? I mean, how'd Merlin get back if you shut the focusing book on him? I don't know, James mused. He hadn't really thought about it. But he did get back. I guess he has other means of getting around. If that was really him. It was him, Zane said, nodding. You just don't want to admit it. James frowned, but before he could object, Zane went on. But the good news is he must have been there for all the right reasons. Otherwise, you'd be toast, wouldn't you? What do you mean? James asked warily. I mean, he saw you, didn't he? You said that the pale dude pointed out of the mirror right at you, and everyone turned to look. That means Merlin saw you. If he was in league with these guys, he'd have come for you three the moment he got back. You'd all be banished to the netherworld, or whatever it is guys like Merlin do to their enemies. James furrowed his brow. I hadn't thought of it that way. Of course, you hadn't, Zane shrugged. I was always the brains of the outfit. James grimaced. Well, either way, I'll know more after tonight. In fact, I thought you were my wake-up call. I've got some sneaking around to do, and I'm a little nervous about it. I don't even have the invisibility cloak this time. So anyway, what about you? How are things at Alma-Dal-Aeron? You wouldn't believe it, Zane said, shaking his head. Classes are positively huge, and the wizarding community over here is way different. There are actual Sasquatches in some of my classes. Big feet. And let me tell you, they're a lot smarter than they look, even if they do only talk in grunts. Also, the progressive element is all over the place around here, only they don't call themselves that. They just talk a lot about how the old ruling elite have always halted change and stifled progress, stuff that sounds all great until you remember that change and progress are the same things that make milk go sour. Anyway, a lot of them give me the evil eye because they think they know what happened there at Hogwarts last year. Madame Delacroix's in prison, you know. A lot of people talk like she's a hero, like some kind of political exile. It's completely quantum to me. The Voodoo Queen's in prison? James asked, his eyes going wide. They have wizarding prisons there? Well, it's more of a mental hospital, but it's under total lockdown. She was never really the same after that night in the grotto keep. She got a little cracked, if you know what I mean. Technically, she's just under observation. In fact, she's right here, on campus, in the medical building. Hey, Cedric. How's the ghosting going? James looked up and saw Cedric moving across the room, smiling half-heartedly. It's time, the ghost said, addressing James. That's right, Zane said. You have your big plans to spy out the headmaster. Look, are you certain that's a good idea? That guy must have anti-spy traps all over the place. You can't just waltz into his office even if you did have the invisibility cloak. I've got a plan, James said, firming his jaw. So, Zane replied, rolling his eyes. Well, if it's as solid as the plans we came up with last year, then I feel loads better. You're fading out again, mate, James said, climbing out of the chair and turning to join Cedric. Pop up anytime you want. You can count on it. Good luck. And James? James stalked and turned. Zane was fading almost to nothing. He looked even ghostlier than Cedric. Keep me in the loop, you know it. I was there when Merlin showed up. If he has gone to the dark side, I want to know about it. Maybe I can help. He hasn't, James said. Don't worry about it. Zane grinned. I didn't say I was worried. A moment later, the figure of Zane evaporated like a puff of smoke. As they slipped through the portrait hole, Cedric asked, what was that all about? James shook his head. Just Zane being Zane. Come on, let's get this over with. So what do you need me to do? James took a deep breath and looked down the very dark, very silent corridor. Just get me into the headmaster's office, he whispered. After that, as Zane would say, it's all quantum. James had hoped that the password to the headmaster's staircase hadn't changed since he, Ralph, and Rose had gone to ask permission to start the defense club. By the time he got to the gargoyle guarding the entrance, he'd nearly forgotten the old Welsh phrase, but when he remembered it and said it aloud, the gargoyle stepped tiredly aside. Nothing good comes from such a late visit, the gargoyle muttered as James and Cedric passed. But then again, what do I know? My head's made of marble. At the top of the staircase, Cedric walked silently through the office door. A few moments later, the bolt shot back from the inside and the door creaked slowly open. They're all asleep, Cedric whispered, indicating the headmaster's portraits. Even Dumbledore and Snape. James nodded and crept into the room. The office was quite dark and foreboding, despite the sound of mingled snores from the portraits. A single beam of moonlight laid a stripe across the floor, up the front of the massive desk, and across Merlin's focusing book. James crept across the floor toward the desk, not wishing to look at the Amcerous earth but unable to avoid it. The surface of the mirror was thick with rolling, silvery smoke, casting its own pale light on the nearby furnishings. I only need a few minutes, James whispered, his teeth chattering. The headmaster's office was unusually cold. James could see his breath puffing as he spoke. I just need you to lock the door afterwards. There was no answer. Cedric had already gone out to the hallway to wait. He'd told James that he hated being in Merlin's office. Too many traps, he'd explained simply, even for a ghost. Something white and flitting reached lazily out toward James. He jumped, and his heart lurched up into his throat, pounding wildly. It was only the linen curtains hung over the window, billowing in a sudden breeze. It was no wonder the office was so cold. Merlin had left his window open, leaving the cold night wind to play in the curtains. Through the window, James could just see the arc of the moon. It hung in the sky like a bone-colored scythe. He shivered and willed his heart to stop pounding. Trembling, he turned back to the desk. The focusing book seemed to glow in the beam of moonlight. The closed cover was very thick, bound with polished wood and brass hinges. There was a lock, but it was unlatched. James touched the book, and then quickly opened it, wanting to get the task over as soon as possible. The pages were heavy, made of a rich, creamy paper that slid easily under James' fingertips. Every page was almost entirely blank, except for a single line handwritten in ink, a place and a date. James flipped through them as quickly and carefully as possible, reading each one. After a minute, an idea struck him. He flipped to the end of the book and found blank pages. Quickly, he paged backwards, riffling through the heavy, blank pages until he got to the last one with writing on it. He stopped, jabbed a finger at it and read, "The Grave of the Sought Host, October." This was it. He hoped it would work, and yet, even now, part of him also hoped it wouldn't. He backed away from the book, his eyes wide and his heart still hammering. He could tell by the change in the lighting of the room that the mirror had focused. There was the sound of wind creaking in trees and rustling leaves. Slowly, James produced his glasses from the pocket of his pajamas and put them on. He didn't want to miss anything this time. Finally, he turned around. The scene was exactly as he'd remembered. There was the grave of Tom Riddle, choked with vines and topped with the smiling, handsome statue. Daylight filtered through the trees, gray and misty. Now that James knew what to look for, he could see the creature of smoke and ash standing in front of the grave. As before, the ragged bottom of the cloak blew in the wind with no feet coming out of it. Something about the figure defied the eye, forced it away, but James made himself look at it. Was this the gatekeeper of whom Farragon had spoken? James felt a sinking certainty that it was. As before, it looked less like a cloaked figure and more like a hole cut in space, showing some awful infinity of swirling blackness and swarming cinders. James waited and watched, shivering in the cold of the headmaster's office. Outside, the wind seemed to be increasing. It pushed restlessly through the window, flapping the curtains. Finally, as James watched, the gatekeeper raised its arm, letting the sleeve fall back. The hand was thin and pale, as it had been the first time James had seen it, and James thought he could tell that it wasn't really a human hand at all, but simply a shape meant to look like one. This time, the hand didn't beckon. It remained upraised for a long moment. And then the figure turned its head. The cloak's hood was empty, but it was obviously looking at James through the mirror. James gasped and stepped back. Several things happened at once. A gust of wind roared in through the window, streaming the curtains and riffling the pages of the focusing book. The door to the headmaster's office was thrown wide open, slamming against the inside wall. And light poured in from the hall, revealing a large, stalking silhouette. James plunged forward, trying to hide in the shadow of the magic mirror. Before James' face, the mirror glass altered as the pages of the focusing book riffled. Scenes flickered past, rising and falling out of the silvery smoke. Elsewhere in the office, the portraits of the former headmasters were now awake, although none spoke. The silhouetted figure stalked through the room, searching it. James had been discovered. Whoever it was would see him at any moment. James huddled, pressing his hands to the glass, panting and terrified. He wished he could be anywhere else at that very moment. And then, suddenly, he was. There was a horrid, disorienting sense of flipping, as if James' entire body had been turned inside out. It was over almost before he knew what was happening. Suddenly, the scene in the mirror wasn't the silvery smoke, it was the headmaster's office, but backwards, somehow. James could clearly see the shadow of a large man moving over the floor on the other side of the mirror, and then the man himself walked into view, very close. It was Merlin, his eyes wide and searching. Without thinking, James ducked below the surface of the mirror. Desperately, he peered up, craning his neck to see if he'd been discovered. From this new angle, the scene in the mirror looked different. In fact, the mirror itself was different. It was rather smaller, framed in silver, and hung on a stone wall rather than in a wooden frame. James frowned, confused and frightened. Now that he looked around, he could see he was in an entirely different place. Somehow, he'd come through the mirror. When he'd wished to be somewhere else, he'd been touching the answerous earth, and the mirror had apparently made his wish come true. How could he have been so careless? The focusing book's pages had been riffling in the wind, so there was no way to tell what page of the book he had been sent to. James tried to take stock of his surroundings. He was still huddled below the new mirror, hunkered in a narrow space between the wall and a sort of huge stone block. There were voices nearby. Very carefully, James raised his head. The block was about 3 feet high with an enormous, complicated shape rising out of it. With a start, James realized it was a statue. It looked vaguely familiar, although it was hard to tell from this angle. James peered around a monstrous, carved foot, trying very hard not to breathe. The voices were very close by, and as James peered, he finally saw the owners of the voices. There were 4 people, all dressed in robes and clothes of various colors. They were facing away from James, forming a rough line. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash and a puff of acrid smoke. "One for the ages, methinks," a hearty voice cried. "A pity it won't be in color." "Color will come soon enough, Godric," a woman's voice trilled happily. "And perhaps even movement, like little living paintings." "We already have moving paintings," a second man's voice said with a hint of a sneer. "I fail to see how this process is in any way superior." "Always the skeptic, Salazar," a different woman's voice commented. "Rowena's inventiveness should be lauded, not criticized. Leave that to the apprentices, whose work it is to refine her technique." James' eyes nearly bulged out of his head. Now that the photo had been taken, the 4 individuals were gravitating toward the rotunda exit. Nearby, a small, grizzled goblin was extinguishing the flash mechanism while another goblin disassembled a gigantic, ancient camera. As the 2 women and 2 men walked out into the sunlit hall, James looked up at the high archway. There, carved carefully in the stone, at the peak of the arch, each letter as sharp as the chisel that had cut it, were the words, Scola. Hogvartensis artium magicarum et fascinationis. James slumped back against the wall as the voices faded. There was no doubt about it. Somehow, impossibly, he had been hurled back in time to the founding of Hogwarts. He was in the old rotunda, hiding under the intact statue of the founders, as the founders themselves walked into the light of a 1,000-year-old sunset. But what struck James as the most absurd thing of all was that Ashley Doone had been right that day in History of Magic. James was the ghost in the plinth,